The Billy Meier tapes, Switzerland's quietest secret. A special thanks to Dogface680 for the suggestion. Picture this. A farmhouse perched on rolling Swiss hills. Morning mist curls through pine forests. Cowbells echo in the distance. It's the kind of place where nothing happens. The kind of place the world forgets exists. But in this forgotten valley, something impossible unfolded. Something that would split researchers, scientists, and governments into warring camps for half a century. And it all started with a one-armed Swiss farmer who claimed he was talking to beings from beyond the stars. This is the story of Eduard Albert Meier. Some call him a prophet, others call him the greatest hoaxer who ever lived. But here's what nobody can explain. Why would Swiss intelligence keep files on a simple farmer? Why would American military officers fly halfway around the world to interview him? And why, decades later, are his original photographs still locked away in national archives, sealed until the year 2031? Before we dive into the mystery, before we examine the evidence that has baffled experts and sparked endless debate, let me be clear about one thing. This documentary doesn't exist to tell you what to believe. It exists to show you what they tried to hide. And trust me, once you see the pattern, once you connect the dots they hoped would stay scattered, you'll never look at the night sky the same way again. So turn off your phone, lock the door. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about flying saucers. It's a story about power, control, and the most dangerous thing any government can face. The truth. A country that doesn't do UFO drama. Switzerland doesn't do drama. It's written into the national character like chocolate and precision engineering. This is a country where trains arrive on time, where banking secrecy is sacrosanct, where neutrality isn't just policy but identity. The Swiss don't make waves, they don't seek attention, and they certainly don't claim to be in contact with extraterrestrial civilizations. Which makes what happened in the rural village of Schmidruti all the more bizarre. Because in this land of order and discretion, in this place where neighbours know each other for generations and gossip travels faster than any spacecraft, one man's photographs of silver discs would turn a quiet valley into the centre of a decades-long argument between belief, science, and state secrecy. The setting itself seems chosen from a storybook. Rolling green hills dotted with traditional farmhouses, Alpine peaks rising in the distance, fog that settles in the valleys like a blanket muffling sound, creating an atmosphere where the impossible feels almost within reach. This is where Eduard Albert Meier would make his home. This is where the story truly begins. But to understand what happened here, we need to go back. Back to before the photographs. Back to before the investigations and the controversies. Back to a time when a young boy looked up at the Swiss sky and saw something that would change his life forever. The early contacts. The boy in the sky, Eduard Albert Meier, was born on February 3rd, 1937, in Bülach, Switzerland. Just an ordinary Swiss boy in an ordinary Swiss town, or so it seemed. But according to Meier himself, ordinary ended when he was just 5 years old. The year was 1942. The world was at war, though Switzerland maintained its careful neutrality. Young Edward was playing near Hinwil, a small village south of Zurich, and that's when he says he saw it. A shining craft, silent as snow, hovering above the trees. Not a plane, not a helicopter. Something else entirely. Most 5-year-olds who claim to see strange things in the sky get patted on the head and told they have active imaginations. Most grow up, forget their childhood fantasies, move on with life. Eduard Meier did not. Instead, he would spend the next 2 decades searching for answers, travelling the world, gathering experiences that would either validate his childhood vision or cement his descent into delusion. Which one depends entirely on who you ask. The Wanderer. The 1950s found young Meier seeking adventure far from the manicured valleys of Switzerland. He joined the French Foreign Legion, that legendary military force that asks no questions about your past and promises only hardship in return. It was the kind of choice that speaks to a restless spirit, someone searching for something they can't quite name. His travels took him through India, Pakistan, and Greece. He walked ancient roads, slept under foreign stars, absorbed cultures that existed long before Switzerland was even conceived. And according to his later accounts, he kept seeing things. Strange lights in the desert, unusual aircraft that moved in ways that defied physics, encounters that he would later claim were part of an ongoing contact program. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. In 1964, while in New Delhi, Meier filed a complaint with local police. The complaint? He claimed he was being followed by officials who kept asking about sky photographs. Strange photographs. Photographs he claimed showed things that shouldn't exist. Now you might expect such a complaint to be dismissed as paranoid rambling, filed away and forgotten, but that's not what happened. The complaint was logged, assigned a file number, and entered into official records. New Delhi Police File number 2174/64. It exists, it's archived, and more importantly, it's real. Think about that for a moment. In 1964, a Swiss national in India is claiming government officials are harassing him about photographs of unidentified flying objects. And the police take it seriously enough to create an official record. This wasn't some backwater station, this was New Delhi. And they documented it. The contact begins, 1963. Meier claims this was the year everything changed. This was the year he says he met Svath. Not a human from Earth, but an elderly being who appeared remarkably human-like. Svath, according to Meier, came from the Pleiaren, a civilization connected to what we know as the Pleiades star cluster. The Pleiades, that gorgeous cluster of stars visible to the naked eye. Ancient cultures around the world have told stories about them. The Greeks called them the Seven Sisters. The Japanese call them Subaru. Native American tribes have legends about beings from those stars, and now, in the 20th century, a Swiss man was claiming active contact with beings from that very region of space. Svath, Meier said, was not an invader or a conqueror. He was a teacher. Over several years, this being allegedly imparted knowledge about human history, cosmic philosophy, and the nature of reality itself. The sessions, Meier claimed, were educational, preparatory, getting him ready for something bigger that was yet to come. Skeptics, of course, had a field day with this. A one-armed Swiss farmer who barely finished basic schooling, claiming to be in contact with advanced extraterrestrial teachers. It sounded like the setup for a bad science fiction novel. But Meier was undeterred. He kept detailed notes. He shared his experiences with a small circle of believers, and he waited. But here's the thing that researchers couldn't quite dismiss. By the mid-60s, Eduard Meier was already showing up on Swiss intelligence watch lists. Not as a threat exactly, but as someone of interest. Someone engaged in what they termed foreign ideological influence. In Cold War speak, that was code. Code for someone exchanging information across international borders. Someone whose activities might have implications beyond simple civilian life. Why would a simple farmer, a man with no political connections or scientific credentials, be worth monitoring? What kind of information could he possibly have that would interest intelligence services? The official explanation, if you could even call it that, was vague. Suspicious foreign contacts, unusual correspondence, nothing concrete, nothing actionable, but enough to keep a file open, enough to keep watching. And so, the stage was set. A man with claims of extraterrestrial contact, intelligence agencies quietly taking notes, and a decade of relative silence about to explode into one of the most documented and controversial UFO cases in history. The calm before the storm, the gathering of clouds that would soon unleash a deluge of evidence, argument and mystery that continues to this day. The photographic evidence enter Semjase, January the 28th, 1975. If you ask Eduard Meier, this was the day his life's purpose crystallized. This was the day he claims he met Semjase. Not the elderly teacher Svath, but a woman. Young, he said, striking. And according to Meier, also from the Or, player and civilization from somewhere in the region of the Pleiades. The meeting took place in the Swiss countryside, in the kind of isolated location that Meier seemed to prefer, away from crowds, away from skeptics. Just him, his camera, and the alleged visitor from the stars, and this time Meier came prepared. He had a camera, a simple camera, the kind any tourist might carry. But what he would capture with that camera would ignite debates that rage to this day. Over the next 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, Eduard Meier produced an absolutely staggering amount of alleged evidence. We're talking over 600 still photographs, 9 reels of Super 8 motion picture film, 4 separate audio recordings of what he claimed were beamship sounds, the propulsion systems of extraterrestrial craft. 600 photographs. Think about that number. This wasn't a one-time sighting. This wasn't a blurry shot of something vague in the distance. This was systematic documentation. Multiple angles, different locations, various times of day. If this was a hoax, it was elaborate. If it was real, it was unprecedented. The photographs showed classic disc-shaped craft. Smooth metallic surfaces, some hovering near trees, providing clear scale reference, others against mountain backgrounds, some in daylight, others in twilight. The craft displayed a consistency in design, a coherent aesthetic that ran through hundreds of images. They weren't random, they weren't chaotic. They showed what appeared to be the same type of vehicle, photographed repeatedly over years. The investigators arrive. News of Meier's photographs spread, not through social media or viral internet posts, which didn't exist yet, but through the tight-knit community of UFO researchers who corresponded by mail, shared photocopies, and travelled internationally to investigate cases. And when word reached the United States, 3 people took particular interest. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Stevens, retired from the United States Air Force, Lee Elders and Britt Elders, researchers with backgrounds in documentation and analysis. Together they formed what would become known as the Interplanetary Research Group, working in liaison with Meier's organisation, which went by the name FIGU. Now, Wendell Stevens wasn't some random enthusiast. He had spent years in Air Force intelligence. He had clearances. He had experience analysing photographs and assessing evidence. When he decided to investigate Meier's claims, he brought resources and expertise that few civilian researchers could match. He wasn't coming to Switzerland as a believer or a debunker. He was coming to apply methodology, to test the evidence, to separate fact from fiction. The team brought samples of Meier's photographs back to the United States for analysis. They consulted with photo experts. They examined the negatives for signs of manipulation. They looked for strings, for miniatures, for any evidence of fakery. And what they found was puzzling. Some experts found nothing wrong with the photographs, no obvious signs of darkroom manipulation, no clear evidence of models or trickery. The Swiss photo laboratory Schenck AG in Zurich examined the images and reported no immediate signs of tampering. The pictures appeared to show what they purported to show, unusual craft in the Swiss countryside. But then came the skeptics, and they had their own analysis. Teams of researchers worked to replicate Meier's photographs using miniature models. They hung small discs from fishing line. They photographed them against similar backgrounds, and they achieved results that looked remarkably similar to Meier's images. The conclusion for the skeptics at least was clear. The photographs showed models, small objects photographed to appear large, a clever hoax, but a hoax nonetheless. The metal sample. But photographs weren't the only evidence Meier claimed to have. He also had something physical, a metal fragment, small, unremarkable in appearance, but allegedly given to him by his extraterrestrial contacts. A sample, he said, from their technology. Physical proof that could be tested, analysed and verified. Wendell Stevens brought this fragment to Marcel Vogel, a physicist working at IBM research labs in San Jose, California. Vogel was not a UFO researcher. He was a legitimate scientist with credentials and a reputation to protect. When he agreed to analyse the metal sample, he approached it as he would any other specimen, with rigorous methodology and an open but sceptical mind. The analysis took place between 1978 and 1979. Vogel subjected the metal to various tests, examining its structure at microscopic levels, analysing its composition, looking for anything unusual. And what he found was intriguing. The metal showed what he described as complex isotopic layering, unusual patterns that didn't match conventional manufacturing techniques. But here's where things get frustrating if you're looking for definitive answers. Vogel couldn't verify the origin. The metal was unusual, yes. It had properties that weren't immediately explainable, yes. But was it extraterrestrial? Was it proof of advanced technology? Vogel couldn't say. The analysis was inconclusive. Interesting, but not definitive. Suggestive, but not proof. And that's the pattern that would emerge again and again with the Meier case. For every scientific finding that seemed to support his claims, there was an equal and opposite debunking. For every expert who said the evidence was compelling, another expert dismissed it as obvious fakery. The case existed in a perpetual state of deadlock, with neither believers nor skeptics able to deliver a knockout blow. What couldn't be disproved was simply shelved, filed away in the growing archive of unexplained phenomena, too controversial to accept, too well documented to completely dismiss. And so it sat, gathering dust and raising questions that nobody seemed willing or able to answer. The investigations and the disappearances enter the debunker, 1980. Just as Edward Meier's photographs were gaining international attention, a young man named Cal Korff decided to take on the case. Korff was a skeptic, and he made no secret of it. He believed that UFO cases, especially ones as spectacular as Meier's, needed rigorous investigation, not blind acceptance. And he was determined to prove that Meier was a fraud. Korff's investigation became known as the Meier incident. He examined the photographs with a critical eye. He measured objects in the images, calculated scales, looked for inconsistencies, and his conclusion was damning. The photographs, Korff claimed, showed models. Small models, somewhere between 20 and 30 centimetres in size, photographed to look like full-scale craft. He pointed to elements in the photographs that suggested miniatures. Shallow depth of field, the kind you'd get from photographing small objects up close. Suspicious shadows that didn't quite match the supposed scale. Evidence of fishing line in some images. For Korff, the case was closed. Meier was a talented model maker and photographer, but ultimately a hoaxer. Meier's supporters, of course, disputed these findings. They argued that Korff's analysis was flawed, that he had made assumptions about scale and lighting that weren't justified. They pointed out that Meier had only one arm, making it difficult to simultaneously operate a camera and suspend models. They offered counter-explanations for every point Korff raised. The debate raged on, each side convinced of their correctness, neither able to persuade the other. The fire 1981. Edward Meier's farmhouse caught fire. Not a small fire. Not a kitchen accident quickly extinguished. A serious blaze that destroyed significant portions of the building, and with the building went dozens of photograph negatives and handwritten logs. Evidence, documentation, records, gone. The fire chief who responded was a local volunteer named Ernst Huber. He gave an interview to the Winterthur newspaper, the Winterthur Zeitung, and what he said was strange. The fire, he explained, started electrically. That wasn't unusual in itself. Electrical fires happen. But here's the odd part. When investigators examined the wiring, they found it untouched, intact. The fire had started electrically, but the wiring showed no evidence of a short circuit, no signs of the kind of malfunction that would cause such a blaze. For believers, this was proof of interference. Someone, they argued, had deliberately destroyed evidence, maybe government agents, Maybe intelligence operatives trying to suppress proof of extraterrestrial contact. The convenient destruction of so much material seemed too suspicious to be coincidental. Skeptics had a different interpretation. Convenient was exactly the word, they said. Convenient, for Meier. With negatives destroyed, there was no way to definitively prove the photographs were faked. The fire destroyed evidence that might have exposed the hoax. The suspicious electrical start was just an attempt to add drama to what was ultimately an accident, or worse, arson committed by Meier himself to cover his tracks. As with everything in the Meier case, interpretation depended entirely on which lens you viewed events through. The same facts led to completely opposite conclusions, and the truth, whatever it might be, remained frustratingly elusive. Stevens and the arrest 1982. Wendell Stevens, the retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel who had invested years investigating Meier's case, was arrested in the United States. The charges were unrelated to UFOs or Meier. At least that was the official story. But the timing struck many as suspicious. Meier's supporters immediately claimed foul play. They argued that the arrest was a pretext, a way to seize evidence that Stevens had collected during his investigation. They pointed to the fact that Stevens had spent years in Air Force intelligence, that he had connections and access that made him a threat to any cover-up. The arrest, they said, was about silencing someone who knew too much. The skeptics rolled their eyes. Stevens, they noted, had been convicted of legitimate crimes. There was no evidence that the charges were trumped up, or that the arrest had anything to do with UFOs. The idea that intelligence agencies would orchestrate such an elaborate scheme to discredit someone investigating a Swiss farmer's photographs was, in their view, absurdly paranoid. But the questions lingered. If Stevens had been collecting evidence, what happened to it? Were his files examined during the investigation? Were copies made? Did authorities have access to material that never saw public release? We don't know, and that uncertainty leaves room for speculation, conspiracy theories, and continued debate. The break-in, 1984. An attempted break-in at Figu headquarters, Meier's organisation, the centre of his operations, the repository of whatever evidence and documentation remained. Someone tried to get in. And according to Swiss police reports, when they examined the scene, they found something strange. Files had been rifled through, searched, but nothing was stolen. Nothing stolen. Think about that. Break-ins are about theft. Burglars take valuables. They steal electronics, cash, anything they can fence. They don't carefully search through files and then leave empty-handed, unless they weren't there to steal, unless they were there to find something, to learn something, to gather intelligence. The official investigation went nowhere. No suspects identified. No arrests made. The case was filed away as an attempted burglary, motive unknown. But for those watching the Meier story, it was another data point, another strange incident in a growing list of strange incidents. Fires that destroyed evidence, arrests of key investigators. And now a break-in where nothing was taken but files were searched. A pattern was emerging. Whether that pattern indicated conspiracy or coincidence depended once again on perspective. Embassy Communications, 1988. In the era before email made communication instant and ubiquitous, embassies relied on cable traffic. Diplomatic communications sent securely, documenting activities that governments wanted to monitor. And in 1988, the United States Embassy in Bern sent cables that mentioned Edward Meier. We only know this because of Freedom of Information Act requests filed years later. In 2006, researchers obtained declassified documents from the embassy, and there it was, in black and white. References to Swiss national Meier, descriptions of him as a sensitive local media subject, language that suggested his case was being monitored, tracked, reported on. Why would the American embassy in Switzerland be sending cables about a farmer who claimed to photograph UFOs? What made this a sensitive media subject worthy of diplomatic attention? The declassified documents don't provide detailed explanations. They offer fragments, glimpses, hints of a larger picture that remains hidden. But the existence of these cables confirms something important. Edward Meier was not just some local eccentric ignored by authorities, he was on the radar. Multiple governments were paying attention, and they were communicating about him through official channels, treating his case as something that required monitoring. The question is why? Why did a Swiss farmer merit this level of attention? What were they afraid he might reveal? Or what did they know that the public didn't? The cables exist. The interest was real, but the reasoning behind it remains classified, locked away behind walls of national security and government secrecy. The prophecies and the classified files. Predictions. Before the fact, Edward Meier didn't just claim to photograph extraterrestrial craft, he also claimed to receive information about future events, predictions, prophecies, knowledge of things that had not yet occurred but, according to his alleged contacts, were certain to unfold. And some of these predictions, documented in Fig publications, came true. The collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the world watched in astonishment as the superpower that had defined geopolitics for decades simply ceased to exist. The Berlin Wall had fallen, Eastern European nations gained independence, and the USSR itself dissolved into separate republics. It was a seismic shift, unexpected by most analysts, predicted by almost no one. Except, according to his supporters, Edward Meier had predicted it years earlier: rising Islamic extremism. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, terrorism motivated by radical interpretations of Islam became a defining challenge for global security. September 11th happened. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed. The rise of ISIS shocked the world, and again, Meier's publications claimed he had warned of this trend before it became obvious to everyone else. Global warming acceleration. By the early 2000s, climate change had moved from fringe scientific concern to mainstream political issue. The evidence was undeniable. Temperatures rising, ice caps melting, weather patterns shifting. And once more, Fig publications pointed to earlier predictions that Meier had made about environmental crisis. Now, skeptics immediately cry foul. Post-dating, they say. These predictions were backdated after the events occurred. Anyone can claim to have predicted something once it's already happened. Show us the original documents, they demand. Prove these predictions were made when you claim they were made. And that's where things get interesting. Because Figure points to Bulletin number 28, published in 1987. Physical copies exist. Multiple people possess them. Libraries hold them. And these copies contain predictions about events that wouldn't occur for years afterward. Print timestamps, distribution records, evidence that these documents existed before the events they described. Could these be faked? Could someone have altered documents, planted false evidence of earlier predictions? Theoretically, yes, but the effort required would be substantial. Multiple copies would need to be faked and distributed. Libraries would need to be fooled. A conspiracy of printers, distributors, and archivists would be necessary. Possible, but increasingly elaborate. The Federal Police Memo, 2003. Switzerland, a country famous for discretion and privacy, declassified a memo from the Swiss Federal Police. Not a long document, not a detailed investigation, just a brief notation, acknowledging surveillance of FIGU due to foreign press interest involving United States citizens formerly attached to Air Force intelligence. Read that again. The Swiss Federal Police were monitoring a UFO group because American military intelligence personnel were interested in it. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This was official acknowledgement that law enforcement and intelligence agencies were watching Meier and his organisation. The memo is brief, almost casual in its revelation, but the implications are enormous. It confirms that multiple governments viewed the Meier case as something requiring attention. It confirms that military intelligence personnel were involved, and it confirms that this involvement was significant enough to warrant official documentation and ongoing surveillance. Why? What about a Swiss farmer's UFO photographs would interest Air Force intelligence? What did they think he might have? What were they afraid he might reveal? The memo doesn't say. It simply confirms the surveillance, acknowledges the interest, and then falls silent. And that silence is deafening, because it transforms the Meier case from a question of belief into a question of policy. It's no longer about whether flying saucers are real. It's about why governments treat them as real enough to monitor, investigate, and classify. The shift in focus. By the early 2000s, something had changed. The debate about Meier's photographs had reached an impasse. Believers and skeptics had their evidence, their arguments, their conclusions. Neither side was going to convince the other. The photographs would remain perpetually contested, forever balanced between proof and hoax. But something new had emerged, something more important than the photographs themselves. The pattern of government interest, the confirmed surveillance, the diplomatic cables, the intelligence connections. These weren't matters of interpretation. These were documented facts. The case was no longer about sources. It was about information control. In an age when photography had become digital, when anyone could manipulate images, when special effects could create anything imaginable, the physical evidence became less relevant. What mattered was the institutional response. What mattered was what governments chose to hide, and they chose to hide a lot. Files sealed, documents classified, evidence locked away with release dates decades in the future. If Meier was just a hoaxer, why the secrecy? If the photographs were fake, why not expose them definitively and move on? The very act of classification, of sealing records, of maintaining surveillance, all of this suggested something more complex than simple fraud. The story had evolved. What began as a case about extraordinary photographs had transformed into a case about extraordinary cover-up, and that shift made all the difference. The modern legacy, the Archive Lock 2006. After decades of controversy, debate and investigation, the Swiss National Archive made a decision. They would scan Eduard Meier's remaining negatives, the photographs that had survived fires and investigations, the images that had launched 1,000 arguments. They would be digitally preserved, ensuring they couldn't be lost or destroyed. But there was a catch. The scanned images would be restricted. Sealed from public view, not forever, but until 2031. Data protection reasons, the archive said. Privacy concerns. Standard protocol for sensitive materials, 2031. Think about that date. These photographs were taken in the 1970s. By 2031, they'll be over 50 years old. Meier himself will likely be gone. Everyone directly involved will be elderly or deceased. What privacy concerns require a 50-year seal? What data protection justifies locking away evidence for half a century? Skeptics argue that the seal is meaningless. The photographs have been extensively analysed. Copies exist. Sealing the originals changes nothing. If anything, it's bureaucratic theatre, giving importance to images that have already been debunked. Believers see something more sinister. Why seal photographs unless they show something worth hiding? Why restrict access unless analysis might reveal uncomfortable truths? The very act of classification, they argue, is an admission that these images matter, that they show something authorities don't want publicly verified. Modern analysis technology advanced. Film gave way to digital. Photo analysis evolved from darkroom techniques to sophisticated computer algorithms, and researchers continued to examine Meier's evidence with these new tools. 2014. Professor Hugh Trent from Bournemouth University examined newly digitised 8mm film from Meier's collection. Motion parallax analysis, a technique that can reveal depth and scale by analysing how objects move relative to each other in video footage. If the craft in Meier's films were small models close to the camera, motion parallax would expose them. The analysis came back inconclusive. inconclusive. That word again, not proof, not debunking, just inconclusive. The analysis couldn't definitively determine whether the objects were large craft at distance or small models nearby. The footage was ambiguous, capable of supporting either interpretation depending on assumptions made during analysis. 2019. A team employed three-dimensional photogrammetry, a technique that reconstructs spatial relationships from multiple photographs. They analysed the background hills in Meier's images, comparing them to actual topography. The result? The hills were real, the locations were genuine, but the scale of the craft remained indeterminate. The objects could be large and distant or small and close. The technology couldn't resolve the question. Decade after decade, new techniques were applied. Each one promised definitive answers. Each one delivered ambiguity. The case remained stubbornly resistant to resolution, as if deliberately constructed to exist in a state of permanent uncertainty. The Silent Witness, 2022. Edward Meier is 85 years old. Most of his life has been defined by controversy, by being simultaneously celebrated and ridiculed, believed and dismissed. FIGU, his organisation, continues to publish bulletins claiming ongoing telepathic transmissions. The contacts, they say, never stopped. But Meier himself has largely withdrawn from public view. He declines interviews. He doesn't engage with skeptics. He has nothing more to prove, nothing more to say. His evidence stands or falls on its own. The photographs exist. The documents exist. The government surveillance existed. People can draw their own conclusions. There's something almost zen about his silence. After decades of trying to convince the world, after years of investigation and debate and controversy, he simply stopped trying. The truth, he seems to suggest, will reveal itself, in time, or it won't. Either way, his work is done. And so the man who started it all lives quietly in the Swiss countryside, surrounded by the hills where he claims to have met beings from the stars. Whether those claims are true, whether those beings were real, whether any of it happened as he described, remains the greatest unanswered question of his life. And increasingly it seems like a question he no longer feels compelled to answer. The conspiracy interpretation. The pattern emerges. Step back. Look at the timeline. Not individual incidents, but the pattern they create. What do you see? You see a man who claims extraterrestrial contact. Not unique, not unprecedented. The world is full of such claims. But this man produces evidence. Hundreds of photographs, hours of film, physical samples, detailed logs, an unprecedented volume of documentation. You see intelligence agencies taking interest. Swiss intelligence monitors him in the 1960s. American embassy staff send cables about him in the 1980s. Swiss federal police acknowledged surveillance in 2003. This isn't casual interest. This is sustained, multi-decade attention from multiple governments. You see evidence disappear or become inaccessible. Fire destroys original negatives. Investigators get arrested. Break-ins occur where files are searched but nothing stolen. Remaining materials get sealed in archives for decades. A consistent pattern of evidence being compromised, removed or restricted. You see connections to military intelligence. Wendell Stevens, retired Air Force intelligence officer, leads the investigation. The Swiss Federal Police memo specifically mentions American citizens formerly attached to Air Force intelligence. Project Sigma rumours circulate. This case intersects repeatedly with the intelligence community, and you see predictions that came true, documented before the fact, published in bulletins that can be dated and verified, not vague prophecies open to interpretation, but specific claims about future events that actually occurred. Put it together, what does that pattern suggest? Either Edward Meier is the most elaborate hoaxer in history, capable of fooling photo experts, creating false predictions, and somehow earning the sustained attention of multiple intelligence agencies across decades. Or something else is happening. something that makes governments nervous enough to monitor, classify and suppress. The question of why. If Meier was a fraud, why preserve his negatives under national seal? Simple photographs of miniature models don't warrant that level of protection. They don't justify classification until 2031. They don't explain decades of surveillance. If he was telling the truth, why does every investigative trail end inside government vaults? Why the systematic suppression of evidence? Why the interference with investigators? Why not simply allow the truth to emerge? Unless the truth is too dangerous. Unless confirmation of extraterrestrial contact would destabilise society in ways governments aren't willing to risk. Unless there are agreements in place, treaties perhaps, that prohibit disclosure. Unless the phenomenon is real but controlled, managed through secrecy and denial. This is where conspiracy theory intersects with legitimate questions about government transparency. Because regardless of whether Meier's contacts were real, the government response was real, the surveillance was real, the classification was real. These are documented facts, not speculation. And facts that make you wonder, what else is classified? What other cases receive similar treatment? How many Edward Meiers have there been? People with evidence that got buried under layers of national security? How much truth remains locked in vaults, scheduled for release decades after anyone who could confirm or deny it has died? The intelligence angle Project Sigma. Rumours of an alleged American intelligence operation dealing with extraterrestrial contact. Never officially confirmed, never officially denied. Just whispers in UFO research circles, claims from alleged insiders, documents that may or may not be authentic. Wendell Stevens had spent years in Air Force intelligence. His decision to investigate Meier wasn't random. He brought resources, connections, expertise that few civilian researchers possessed. And his arrest, while officially unrelated to UFOs, occurred at a convenient time, just as his investigation was reaching critical mass. The Swiss Federal Police memo mentions Americans formerly attached to Air Force intelligence showing interest in Fig U. Not hobbyists, not journalists, intelligence personnel. Active or retired, they had backgrounds that suggested their interest was more than casual curiosity. What did they know? What were they looking for in a Swiss farmer's photographs? Was Meier part of something larger? Was he a test case? An experiment in disclosure? A way to measure public reaction to extraterrestrial claims? Was his case allowed to develop precisely because it could be discredited, providing cover for genuine contact programs? These questions have no definitive answers. They sit in that grey zone where documented facts give way to informed speculation. But the questions themselves are legitimate, the intelligence connection is real, and the pattern of suppression is undeniable. Which brings us to the heart of the conspiracy interpretation. Maybe the photographs don't matter. Maybe they were never the real story. Maybe the real story is the response they generated. The surveillance, the classification, the decades of official interest in a Swiss farmer's claims. That response tells us something, even if we're not sure exactly what. The man and the message. What was said in 2011, Edward Meier gave a rare interview at his home in Schmidruti. He was 74 years old. Decades had passed since the first photographs. The controversy had raged and faded and raged again, but through it all, his story remained consistent. Near the end of the interview, Meier said something that cuts to the heart of the entire phenomenon. They told me one thing, he said, referring to his alleged extraterrestrial contacts. Earth must learn truth slowly, or it will destroy itself with knowledge. Think about that statement. Not a promise of disclosure, not a prediction of open contact, but a warning about the dangers of too much truth too fast. The implication being that humanity isn't ready, that we're too divided, too aggressive, too immature to handle the reality of our place in the cosmos. It's a convenient message, skeptics would say, a built-in excuse for why proof never materialises, why contact remains ambiguous, why we're stuck with photographs and stories instead of spacecraft parked on the White House lawn. It's a narrative device, not genuine wisdom from the stars. But believers hear something different. They hear an explanation for the pattern of suppression. If extraterrestrials exist and want gradual disclosure, then government secrecy isn't a cover-up, it's cooperation. Agencies aren't hiding the truth, they're managing it, releasing information slowly, preparing humanity, following a timeline given to them by those who understand our psychology better than we do. Which interpretation is correct? There's no way to know. But the message itself is interesting regardless of its source, because it acknowledges a fundamental problem with disclosure. Proof of extraterrestrial life wouldn't just be a scientific discovery, it would be a psychological, social and philosophical earthquake. Every religion would need to reassess its doctrines. Every government would need to explain its previous denials. Every person would need to reconsider their understanding of human importance. Maybe Meier made up the message. Maybe it's nothing but the rationalization of a man who spent his life claiming extraordinary things without extraordinary proof. Or maybe it's exactly what he says it is. Wisdom from beings who have watched civilizations rise and fall, who understand the danger of revelation, who chose to work through ambiguity rather than certainty. The Alpine sky. The camera pans across the Swiss countryside. The same hills where Meier took his photographs. The same valleys where he claimed to meet beings from the Pleiades. The same sky that has hung over this land for millennia, indifferent to human drama. Nothing has changed here. Farmers still work the land. Cows still graze in meadows. Church bells still mark the hours. The modern world exists elsewhere. Here, time moves slowly, as it always has. But look closer. That farmhouse in the distance. That's where Edward Meier lives. Where he's lived for decades. Where he raised his family, ran his organisation, gave his interviews. Where he looked up at the stars and claimed to know what waited there. The sky hasn't changed, but our relationship to it has. We've sent probes to distant planets. We've discovered thousands of exoplanets. We've acknowledged that the universe is almost certainly teeming with life. The question is no longer if alien civilizations exist, but whether they found us. And in that context, the Meier case takes on a different significance. Maybe his photographs were fake. Maybe his contacts were delusion. But the questions he raised were real. The government interest was real. The secrecy was real. And those facts point to something larger than one man's claims. The final question. Maybe Billy Meier never photographed aliens at all. Maybe he photographed something else. Something more subtle and more profound. Maybe he photographed the line between what the world is allowed to believe and what it isn't. Because that's what this case really reveals. Not flying saucers, not extraterrestrial visitors, but the mechanism of societal control. The way information is managed, controlled, classified and released according to schedules determined by those in power. The way truth becomes a commodity, parcelled out in doses small enough not to cause disruption. Meier's photographs might be models suspended on fishing line. They might be genuine spacecraft from another world. Forensically, scientifically, we may never know with certainty. Technology advances, but so do methods of deception. Analysis becomes more sophisticated, but so do hoaxes. The question of authenticity may be fundamentally unresolvable. But what cannot be faked, what cannot be explained away, is the pattern of official response, the surveillance, the classification, the intelligence connections. These are matters of public record, confirmed through declassified documents, official memos, documented incidents. This part of the story is not ambiguous, and that's where the real mystery lies. Not in the photographs, not in whether Meier told the truth, but in why governments treat these claims as threats. Why they monitor, classify and suppress. What are they protecting? What do they know that we don't? Maybe they know that Meier was a hoaxer and they're monitoring to prevent mass delusion. Maybe they know he was telling the truth and they're managing disclosure. Maybe they don't know, and their response reflects their own uncertainty, their own fear of the unknown. Or maybe the truth is simpler and more disturbing. Maybe they know that it doesn't matter whether the photographs are real. What matters is that people believe. What matters is the potential for social disruption, for loss of control, for questions that undermine the authority structures that govern our world. In that scenario, truth becomes irrelevant. Only control matters. The unanswered questions. So where does that leave us? With a retired Swiss farmer who stopped giving interviews, with photographs sealed until 2031, with government files that confirm surveillance but offer no explanation, with a case that has consumed decades of investigation without reaching resolution. The questions remain. Did Edward Meier photograph extraterrestrial spacecraft? Were his contacts real? Did he receive information from beings more advanced than ourselves? We don't know. And increasingly it seems clear that we're not meant to know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What we do know is that this case reveals something important about how societies handle extraordinary claims. We see the machinery of classification in action. We see how governments respond to potential disruption. We see the gap between official narrative and documented behaviour. And we see that the truth, whatever it might be, is less important to authorities than maintaining control over information. Whether protecting us from mass panic or from mass enlightenment, the result is the same: secrecy, classification, decades of sealed archives and unanswered questions. Edward Meier is 85 years old. The original photographs are 50 years old. The first claims date back 80 years. And still, we wait for answers that may never come. Still, we debate photographs that may never be definitively proven or disproven. Still, we ask questions that governments refuse to address. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the ambiguity is intentional. Maybe truth delivered in fragments, scattered across decades, analysed endlessly without conclusion, is exactly the kind of disclosure someone planned. Not enough to prove anything. Not enough to disprove anything. Just enough to keep us questioning, searching, looking up at the night sky and wondering. The night sky. The documentary ends as it began, with the Swiss countryside, with the Alpine sky, with stars that have watched human civilization struggle toward understanding for all of recorded history. Are we alone? The most fundamental question humanity can ask. And after decades of investigation, after hundreds of photographs, after classified files and government surveillance and scientific analysis, we're no closer to a definitive answer than we were when Edward Meier was 5 years old, claiming to see a shining craft silent as snow. Maybe that's okay. Maybe some questions aren't meant to be answered quickly. Maybe the journey matters more than the destination. Maybe learning to live with uncertainty is part of growing up as a species. Or maybe we're being played. Maybe the ambiguity is deliberate manipulation. Maybe somewhere, in vaults we can't access, on hard drives we can't hack, in files sealed until 2031, the truth sits waiting. Clear, undeniable, known to those with clearance, hidden from the rest of us. Which is it? Unknown, unknowable, at least for now. But next time you look up at the night sky, next time you see stars scattered across the darkness, remember Edward Albert Meier. Remember the Swiss farmer who claimed to photograph the impossible. Remember the governments that took his claims seriously, enough to monitor him for decades. Remember the files that remain sealed. Remember the questions that remain unanswered. And ask yourself, what are they hiding? What don't they want us to know? What truth is too dangerous for public consumption? What reality lies beyond the official narrative? You might not find answers, but at least you'll be asking the right questions. The Billy Meier case. Switzerland's quietest secret. A mystery wrapped in classification, sealed in archives, guarded by decades of official silence. The photographs exist. The documents exist. The truth, whatever it might be, remains elusive. Maybe it's time we demanded better answers. Maybe it's time the vaults were opened. Maybe it's time we learned what Edward Meier really photographed on those Swiss hillsides. Or maybe the truth is already out there, hidden in plain sight, visible to anyone willing to connect the dots, to see the pattern, to ask why a farmer's photographs warrant decades of government attention. The choice is yours. Believe the official dismissals, accept the debunkings, move on with your life, or look closer, dig deeper, question everything. Because in the end, that's what the Billy Meier case really teaches us. Not whether aliens exist, but whether we're brave enough to demand the truth, whether we're willing to challenge authority, whether we're ready to handle whatever reality lies beyond the comfortable lies we've been told. The stars are waiting, the questions remain. And somewhere in the Swiss mountains, an 85-year-old man knows something the rest of us don't, or thinks he does, or wants us to believe he does. Maybe it doesn't matter which. Maybe the mystery is the message. Maybe uncertainty is the only truth we're allowed to have. Until 2031, at least. When the archives open. When the seals break. When we finally learn what they've been hiding all along. If we're still asking questions. If anyone still cares. If the truth still matters by then. The Forbidden Depths, Secrets of the Grand Canyon. Special thanks to Spot Boogie for this incredible suggestion. Imagine standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, staring down into layers of rock that have witnessed millions of years of Earth's history. Now imagine that beneath those ancient stone walls, hidden in chambers carved deep into the cliff face, lies evidence of a civilization so advanced, so impossible, that its very existence would shatter everything we think we know about human history. Imagine that this discovery was made over a century ago, documented in a major newspaper, backed by the most prestigious institution in American science, and then systematically erased from the historical record. This isn't fantasy. This isn't legend passed down through generations. This is a documented story that appeared in black and white, read by thousands, and then mysteriously vanished as if it never happened. The question isn't whether something was found. The question is what they're still hiding. For over 100 years, rumours have persisted that beneath the Grand Canyon's towering red cliffs lies something ancient, something that predates the native civilizations we know, something older even than the pyramids of Egypt. In the spring of 1909, one newspaper printed a story that the world has spent the next century trying to erase, dismiss, and explain away. But the evidence refuses to stay buried. The restricted zones remain off limits. The questions grow louder with each passing year, and somewhere in the depths of America's most iconic natural wonder, the truth waits in darkness. This is the story of the discovery that wasn't supposed to happen, the explorer who vanished from history, and the government conspiracy that may still be guarding the greatest archaeological secret ever found on American soil. The discovery that shook the world, April 5th, 1909, a date that should be remembered alongside the discovery of King Tut's tomb or the unearthing of Pompeii. Instead, it's been relegated to the dustbin of supposed hoaxes and dismissed legends. On that spring morning, the Arizona Gazette published a front-page story that would normally have sent shockwaves through the archaeological world. The headline read in bold type, "Explorations in Grand Canyon, mysteries of immense rich cavern being brought to light." The article wasn't a brief mention or a curiosity piece buried in the back pages. It was a detailed, extensive report spanning multiple columns, written with the kind of specificity that suggests either genuine investigation or an incredibly elaborate hoax. The expedition was credited to a man named G.E. Kincaid, described as an experienced explorer and former officer in the United States Army. According to the Gazette, Kincaid had been conducting a journey down the Colorado River, collecting geological specimens and mapping previously uncharted sections of the canyon when he noticed something unusual high on a cliff face. What drew his attention was a symmetry that shouldn't exist in nature. While the Grand Canyon is filled with natural caves, alcoves and erosion patterns, Kincaid reportedly spotted something different. What appeared to be carved openings approximately 1,500 feet up a sheer rock wall in a remote section of Marble Canyon, near where the Little Colorado River feeds into the main waterway. The location itself was significant, isolated enough that few travellers would pass by, yet positioned where ancient peoples might have sought refuge or built something meant to last through the ages. Kincaid managed to reach the entrance. No small feat given the technical climbing required. What he found inside, according to his account published in the Gazette, was nothing less than a vast subterranean citadel carved directly into the living rock of the canyon itself. The article described passage after passage, some large enough to drive trucks through, others narrow and winding, all showing clear signs of artificial construction. The walls weren't rough stone, but smooth surfaces bearing hieroglyphic inscriptions unlike anything seen in Native American cultures. The article detailed room after room filled with artifacts that seemed impossible, given conventional understanding of pre-Columbian America. There were copper tools of sophisticated design, ceremonial weapons, and tablets covered in unknown writing systems. One chamber reportedly contained dozens of mummified remains, preserved in a manner suggesting advanced knowledge of the process. The mummies themselves were described as being of unusual height and possessing features that didn't match known Native American populations. But the most startling claims came from descriptions of the central chamber, what Kincaid allegedly called the shrine, or crypt. Here, the article reported, were statues and idols that belonged on the other side of the world. There were figures resembling Buddha, carved representations of Egyptian gods, including Osiris with his distinctive crook and flail, and hybrid animal-headed deities that looked like they'd been transported directly from the Valley of the Kings. The implications were staggering. If authentic, these artifacts suggested that either ancient Egyptians and Asians had reached North America thousands of years before Columbus, or that some common ancestral civilization had influenced both the Old World and the New. The Gazette article made clear that this wasn't a rogue expedition by a lone adventurer making wild claims. The story explicitly stated that Kincaid's work was being done under the sponsorship and direction of the Smithsonian Institution itself, America's preeminent museum and research organisation. The article named a Smithsonian representative called S.A. Jordan, who was supposedly leading the detailed excavation and cataloguing of the site. With the Smithsonian's name attached, the story carried weight and credibility that should have sparked immediate academic interest and follow-up investigations. Maps accompanied the article, pointing to the region of Marble Canyon and the area around what would later be designated as restricted zones near Isis Temple. The descriptions were specific enough that any qualified expedition should have been able to relocate the site. The article mentioned landmarks, distances, and geographical features with the kind of detail that suggests the reporter had either seen maps and notes from the expedition or had conducted interviews with someone intimately familiar with the location. For a brief moment in April of 1909, the world had access to what could have been the most important archaeological discovery in American history. And then, almost immediately, the story began to disappear. The vanishing. Within days of publication, something strange began to happen. Or rather, something didn't happen. There was no follow-up article, no competing newspapers sent their own teams to verify the claims. The Smithsonian Institution didn't issue press releases about their groundbreaking discovery. Academic journals didn't publish preliminary findings or call for peer review of the artifacts. The story simply stopped. Researchers attempting to track down G.E. Kincaid in subsequent years found themselves chasing a ghost. While the Arizona Gazette article described him as a former army officer with decades of exploration experience, official military records after 1909 contain no further mention of anyone by that name matching the description. Census records, which should show him living somewhere in America in the 1910 or 1920 counts, come up empty. It's as if G.E. Kincaid ceased to exist the moment his story was published. Even more suspicious, the Smithsonian representative allegedly overseeing the dig, S.A. Jordan, doesn't appear in any official Smithsonian employment records from that era. The institution has no archaeologist, administrator, or researcher by that name in their documented staff lists. When questioned about the expedition in later years, Smithsonian officials would claim complete ignorance, stating that no such expedition was ever funded, authorised, or conducted under their auspices. This presents us with a puzzle. Either the Arizona Gazette completely fabricated an elaborate story, inventing expedition members and creating detailed descriptions from pure imagination, or someone went to significant effort to remove all traces of these individuals from the historical record. The former seems unlikely, given that newspapers of the era, while less rigorous than modern journalism, typically didn't publish complete fabrications about major institutions like the Smithsonian. The latter suggests a level of coordinated erasure that strains credibility, but fits a pattern of what would happen in the years following the article's publication. The timing of subsequent events only deepens the mystery. Between 1910 and 1912, just 1 to 3 years after the Gazette story, the first comprehensive aerial surveys of the Grand Canyon were conducted. These early flights, using primitive aircraft that had only recently become viable for such purposes, carefully mapped the canyon's geography and photographed sections that were difficult or impossible to reach from ground level. Curiously, the photographs from these surveys identified numerous cave openings and carved spaces in the precise region Kincaid had described, particularly near what mapmakers had begun calling Isis Temple. However, by the time more detailed geological surveys were conducted in later years, many of these cave openings had been classified as inaccessible, blocked by rockfalls, or simply too dangerous for exploration. Some appear to have been deliberately sealed, though official explanations cite natural erosion and collapse. The 1919 designation of the Grand Canyon as a national park transferred total control of the area to federal authorities, including the power to restrict access to sensitive regions for safety and conservation purposes. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, occasional mentions of the Kincaid story would surface in fringe publications and regional historical societies, but mainstream archaeology ignored it completely. The Smithsonian's official position remained unchanged. No such expedition ever occurred. When pressed for documentation, the institution claimed that if any artifacts had been collected from the Grand Canyon region during that period, they would have been catalogued in the annual reports, and no such catalogue entries existed. But here's where the story gets interesting. Researchers digging through Smithsonian archives, not the public-facing collections, but the deeper storage facilities and administrative records, have found tantalising hints that something doesn't add up. An internal ledger from 1909 listing donations and acquisitions contains a curious entry describing unnamed copper ceremonial artifacts, with notations indicating they originated from the southwestern United States. The entry provides no specific location and no donor information, unusual for an institution that typically maintains meticulous records of provenance. Could these be artifacts from Kincaid's expedition, deliberately anonymised to break the connection to the controversial claims? The timing matches perfectly, and copper ceremonial objects were specifically mentioned in the Arizona Gazette article. Yet without more information, it remains circumstantial evidence, frustrating in its incompleteness. The 1940s brought another layer to the mystery. During the Second World War and in the years immediately following, the United States military conducted extensive aerial photography and mapping operations across the American Southwest, including highly detailed surveys of the Grand Canyon region. Many of these photographs were classified for national security reasons, ostensibly because they revealed military installations or sensitive infrastructure. However, researchers have noted that several of the classified photo sets focused on regions of the canyon with no apparent military value, areas far from roads, settlements, or strategic resources. What were they photographing? And why did those particular images require classification? The most heavily restricted photographic surveys covered, you guessed it, the area around Isis Temple and the section of Marble Canyon where Kincaid allegedly made his discovery. This suggests that federal authorities had ongoing interest in that specific region, an interest that required keeping details away from public scrutiny. By the 1950s, anyone attempting to investigate the original Gazette story faced a brick wall. The principals were gone, official records denied the expedition's existence, and the location itself had become increasingly difficult to access. The story should have died there, relegated to the status of turn-of-the-century yellow journalism and forgotten folklore. But it didn't die. Instead, it went underground, kept alive by researchers who noticed too many coincidences and too many questions that remained unanswered. The geography of secrets. There's something peculiar about the names scattered across the Grand Canyon's landscape, something that suggests knowledge hidden in plain sight. Open any official map of the canyon and you'll see them. Isis Temple, Tower of Ra, Osiris Temple, Horus Temple, Tower of Set. These aren't informal nicknames given by tourists or casual observers. These are official designations assigned by government cartographers and recognised by the United States Board on Geographic Names. Why would the heart of an American natural landmark be covered in Egyptian mythology? The answer lies in the late 1800s, when geologist Clarence Dutton conducted one of the first comprehensive surveys of the Grand Canyon region. Dutton was responsible for naming many of the canyon's features, and he demonstrated a clear fascination with ancient civilizations, particularly Egyptian culture. His choice of names has been dismissed by mainstream historians as simply reflecting the Victorian era's obsession with Egyptology following major discoveries in the Nile Valley. But here's what makes this fascinating. Dutton began assigning these Egyptian names in the 1880s, nearly 30 years before the Arizona Gazette published the Kincaid story. If the Gazette article was pure fabrication, it's an extraordinary coincidence that the hoaxers chose to locate their fictional, Egyptian-influenced cave system in a region that had already been named after Egyptian gods by an official government geologist decades earlier. Dutton's field journals, preserved in the Library of Congress, contain passages that researchers find intriguing. While conducting his survey work, Dutton made notes about unusual formations and features high in the canyon walls. In several entries, he references what he called anomalous structures, describing them as ruins or possibly carved features distinct from natural erosion patterns. However, he never elaborated on these observations in his published reports. The references remain tantalizingly vague, as if Dutton saw something worth noting but chose not to draw attention to it in official documentation. Could Dutton have been aware of something in those cliffs? Something that influenced his choice to coat the area in Egyptian nomenclature? Or was it truly coincidence that when Kincaid allegedly found his Egyptian-style artifacts and statues, it happened in the shadow of Isis Temple? The statistical probability of this coincidence becomes harder to swallow when you consider the specificity of the correlation. The region around Isis Temple is particularly interesting from a geological standpoint. The temple itself is a massive butte rising over 7,000 feet above sea level, with sheer cliff faces that would have been nearly impossible to scale using early 20th century equipment. Yet the area is riddled with cave systems and natural passages carved by ancient water flow. Geologists have confirmed that the rock layers in this area contain numerous voids and chambers, some quite extensive, formed over millions of years by underground rivers that have long since dried up or diverted course. What makes this relevant is that any ancient civilization looking to create a hidden, protected complex would find this region ideal. The natural cave systems would provide a framework requiring far less carving and excavation than building from scratch. The height and isolation would offer security against intruders and protection from flooding. The geological features would have been as evident to ancient engineers as they are to modern geologists. Modern topographical analysis has revealed something else interesting about the Isis Temple region. Using satellite imagery and advanced mapping techniques, researchers have identified what appear to be trail systems, faint lines suggesting repeated passage over centuries or millennia, leading up the canyon walls toward the higher elevations where caves and alcoves exist. These trails don't match known Native American routes, and they terminate in areas that are now completely inaccessible without technical climbing equipment. The question becomes, who carved these trails, and what were they accessing? Natural erosion doesn't create pathways that snake consistently upward with the kind of gradual grade that would make climbing easier. These appear to be engineered routes, faded and weathered but still visible to trained observers studying the landscape. Additional Egyptian names pepper the surrounding area. Tower of Ra sits nearby, another imposing formation that dominates the landscape. Cheops Pyramid, named after the Great Pyramid of Giza's builder, rises in spectacular isolation. The concentration of these names in one sector of the canyon is remarkable. While other areas of the canyon have names drawn from various mythologies and cultural references, nowhere else is there such a dense clustering of Egyptian nomenclature. It's worth noting that the Smithsonian institution itself published geological surveys of the Grand Canyon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These surveys documented the region's features, including notations about caves and alcoves. However, when researchers attempt to access the complete archives of these surveys, they find that certain sections are missing or have been restricted. Requests for access to these materials are typically denied, with vague references to preservation concerns or incomplete records. The Smithsonian question. The Smithsonian Institution occupies a unique position in American science and culture. Founded in 1846, it serves as both a museum system and a research organisation, often called the nation's attic for its vast collections spanning natural history, art and cultural artefacts. With such a prominent role, any suggestion that the Smithsonian has hidden or suppressed archaeological evidence naturally meets fierce resistance from the establishment. Yet the institution's history isn't without controversy. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Smithsonian was deeply involved in the collection of Native American remains and artifacts, sometimes using methods that would be considered unethical by today's standards. The institution also operated during an era when racial theories influenced archaeological interpretation, leading to biases about which civilizations could have achieved certain levels of technological or cultural sophistication. When it comes to the Grand Canyon expedition, the Smithsonian's denial is absolute and unwavering. No such expedition was authorized. No funding was provided. No researchers named Kincaid or Jordan were employed during that period. The artifacts described in the Arizona Gazette article were never received, catalogued or stored in their facilities. Case closed, according to official statements. However, researchers who've attempted to verify this denial through Freedom of Information Act requests have encountered frustrating obstacles. FOIA requests filed starting in the early 2000s, seeking any documentation related to Grand Canyon expeditions, archaeological surveys in Arizona circa 1909, or anything mentioning G.E. Kincaid or S.A. Jordan, have consistently received the same response: no responsive documents located. This response is technically different from saying such documents never existed. It simply means that if they once existed, they cannot now be located within the institution's searchable records. it leaves open the possibility that documents were destroyed, misfiled, or deliberately removed from accessible archives. Researchers including David Childress and John Rux, who've written extensively about the Kincaid story, have pointed out that the Smithsonian's record-keeping in the early 20th century was far from perfect, with numerous documented cases of lost, misplaced, or inadequately catalogued materials. There's also the matter of institutional policy regarding controversial finds. A whistleblower claim that emerged in the late 20th century alleged the existence of something called Policy 509, described as cultural continuity assurance. According to this claim, which has never been independently verified, this internal policy gave Smithsonian administrators authority to suppress or dispose of artifacts that contradicted the established historical narrative of human migration and cultural development in the Americas. The rationale, supposedly, was to prevent public confusion and maintain coherent historical frameworks for education. In practice, if such a policy existed, it would have meant that any artifact suggesting pre-Columbian contact between Old World and New World civilizations could be quietly set aside, its existence minimized or denied. While no documentary evidence of Policy 509 has ever been produced, and the Smithsonian denies any such directive existed, the claim persists in research communities focused on alternative archaeology. What we do know is that the Smithsonian's collections are vast, containing tens of millions of artifacts, many of which have never been displayed or thoroughly studied. The institution's storage facilities, spread across multiple locations, contain materials that haven't been reviewed in decades. It would be theoretically possible for controversial artifacts to sit in storage, their significance unrecognised or deliberately overlooked, essentially hidden not through active conspiracy, but through bureaucratic inertia and the sheer, overwhelming volume of collected materials. There's precedent for major institutions being wrong about archaeological controversies. For decades, the existence of Viking settlements in North America was dismissed as speculation and legend, with mainstream archaeology insisting that Columbus represented the first meaningful European contact. Then, in 1960, the Lanceau Meadows site in Newfoundland was excavated, providing undeniable proof of Norse settlement centuries before Columbus. The establishment had to revise its position, admitting that the legends had factual basis. Could the Grand Canyon story follow a similar pattern? Could there be genuine artifacts or documentation sitting in storage somewhere, waiting for the right researcher to rediscover them and force a re-examination of the official denial? The possibility can't be entirely dismissed, particularly given the pattern of institutional resistance to claims that challenge accepted historical timelines. Modern researchers have also noted that the Smithsonian's annual reports from 1907 through 1911 show significant gaps in documentation related to southwestern archaeological activities. While expeditions to other regions are thoroughly detailed, with lists of artifacts collected and personnel involved, the southwest section contains notably less information, despite this being a period of active exploration and collection in Arizona and New Mexico. Some researchers suggest this gap is intentional, a quiet zone in the records where controversial materials could be acknowledged in vague terms without drawing attention. Others argue it simply reflects the lower priority given to southwestern sites, compared to more prestigious digs occurring in Egypt, Mesopotamia and Central America during that period. Without access to internal correspondence and administrative records from that era, which the Smithsonian has not made fully available, determining which explanation is correct remains impossible. The restricted zones. Here's where the story moves from historical mystery into present-day reality. Pull up a current map of the Grand Canyon, specifically one showing access restrictions and permit requirements, and you'll notice something interesting. Large sections of the park, particularly in the area around Isis Temple and the Marble Canyon region, are designated as restricted zones where civilian access is prohibited or severely limited without special federal permits. The official explanation for these restrictions is straightforward. Safety and environmental protection. The Grand Canyon is a dangerous place. People die there regularly from falls, exposure and dehydration. Certain areas are considered too hazardous for general public access, with unstable cliff faces, extreme isolation, and routes that would require technical climbing skills beyond what the average visitor possesses. Additionally, sensitive archaeological sites from confirmed Native American cultures need protection from looters and careless visitors who might damage irreplaceable artifacts. All of these are legitimate concerns. The National Park Service has a responsibility to protect both visitors and the natural and cultural resources under their management. However, researchers interested in the Kincaid story have noted that the most heavily restricted areas correspond almost exactly to the region where the alleged cave system would be located, based on the Arizona Gazette article's descriptions. Hikers who've attempted to approach these areas, even with proper backcountry permits for adjacent zones, report unusual encounters. Park rangers appear seemingly from nowhere in extremely remote locations, areas where you wouldn't expect regular patrols. These rangers, according to multiple accounts, are insistent about turning people back, sometimes with an intensity that seems disproportionate to the supposed safety violations. In some cases, hikers report seeing vehicles in areas that shouldn't be accessible by road, unmarked trucks and SUVs that don't match standard park service equipment. There are accounts of helicopter activity at night, running without lights or with minimal lighting, circling the restricted areas. While helicopters are regularly used for rescue operations and scientific research in the canyon, these reports describe flights at odd hours with no apparent emergency situation to justify them. Perhaps most intriguingly, drone enthusiasts have discovered that certain areas of the Grand Canyon are designated as no-fly zones with unusual specificity. While the entire park has restrictions on recreational drone use, the prohibited areas around Isis Temple extend beyond the normal park boundaries and include airspace that would otherwise be available for private aircraft. Attempts to fly drones in these zones result in immediate loss of GPS signal or complete shutdown of the aircraft's systems, suggesting active electronic countermeasures are in place. When questioned about these restrictions, Park Service officials point to a combination of safety regulations, Native American sacred site protections under NAGPRA, and general environmental protection policies. These are all, again, reasonable explanations. Yet the level of enforcement and the technological measures in place seem excessive for areas that officially contain nothing more significant than sensitive ecosystems and ordinary archaeological sites. A researcher named John Rhodes filed a Bureau of Land Management inquiry in 2015, seeking information about underground mapping and geological surveys conducted in the restricted Grand Canyon regions. The BLM, which manages some adjacent federal lands, initially acknowledged the request but ultimately denied release of any responsive information, citing national security exemptions. National security exemptions for geological data about a national park seems unusual, unless there's something in that geological data that touches on defence or intelligence concerns. Google Earth imagery of the area adds another curious detail. While most of the Grand Canyon is available in high-resolution satellite imagery, allowing users to zoom in and see remarkable detail, sections around Isis Temple show notably lower resolution. Some images appear deliberately blurred or pixelated. This kind of intentional image degradation is typically seen around military bases, intelligence facilities, and other sensitive government installations. Why would it be applied to a remote section of national park land? Some researchers have obtained older satellite images from before these restrictions were implemented, comparing them to current available imagery. In a few cases, features visible in older photos, things that appear to be cave entrances or carved openings high on cliff faces, are no longer visible in recent imagery, either because they've been obscured in the images or because something has physically changed at the locations. Without access to the actual sites, determining what's happened is impossible. The pattern of restrictions raises questions. If the Kincaid story was purely fictitious, if there's nothing unusual in those cliffs, why implement such comprehensive access controls? Why employ electronic countermeasures against drones? Why classify geological survey data under national security provisions? The measures in place seem designed to prevent not just physical access, but even remote observation of the area. Local tour guides and long-time canyon residents tell stories, usually quietly and often off the record, about people who've gotten too curious about the restricted zones. There are tales of hikers who ventured into prohibited areas and were not just turned back but questioned extensively about what they'd seen and what they were looking for. Some report having their cameras and phones examined, with photos deleted if they showed features the rangers deemed sensitive. These are difficult stories to verify. Most people aren't willing to go on record about potential violations of park regulations or encounters with federal agents. The stories remain in the realm of anecdote and rumour, but the consistency of the accounts, spanning decades and coming from people with no apparent connection to each other, suggests there might be substance beneath the whispers. The subsurface mystery. In 2019, the University of Arizona, in collaboration with the United States Geological Survey, released results from a deep penetration LiDAR survey of the Grand Canyon region. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain and subsurface features. Advanced LiDAR can penetrate rock and soil to reveal voids, chambers, and structural anomalies that aren't visible on the surface. The survey, which covered large sections of the canyon including areas around Isis Temple, was primarily intended to study geological formation, water flow patterns, and erosion processes. The resulting data was made publicly available through scientific databases, a massive collection of measurements and mappings that would take teams of specialists years to fully analyse. Most people wouldn't know how to interpret the raw data even if they accessed it. However, independent researchers with geological and engineering backgrounds began examining the dataset, looking specifically at the subsurface scans from the Marble Canyon region. What they found was intriguing. The scans revealed numerous voids and chamber-like spaces beneath the surface, which is expected in a region formed by water erosion over millions of years. Natural caves and passages should show up as irregular spaces following the path of least resistance through the rock layers. What caught researchers' attention were several anomalies that didn't fit the pattern of natural formation. The scans showed what appeared to be symmetrical voids, spaces with unusually regular geometry located between 400 and 900 metres below the surface near Isis Temple. Natural erosion doesn't typically create rectangular or square chambers. Water flowing through rock creates organic, flowing shapes with irregular walls and ceilings. The anomalous spaces showed rectilinear characteristics, straight walls meeting at consistent angles, dimensions suggesting deliberate construction rather than random geological processes. The official USGS paper describing the survey results noted these features, classifying them as geological anomalies and suggesting they might represent unusual crystalline structures or rare mineral deposits that created more regular void spaces than typical erosion. Alternative researchers looked at the same data and saw something different. To them, the pattern suggested artificial construction, tunnel systems and chamber complexes carved or excavated beneath the canyon's visible surface. The depth of these features, hundreds of meters down, would place them far below any natural cave systems accessible from the cliff faces. If artificial, they would represent an extraordinary engineering achievement, requiring technology and effort on a massive scale. The debate over interpretation of the LiDAR data represents a microcosm of the larger controversy. Mainstream geologists insist that the features have natural explanations, that researchers are seeing patterns where none exist, falling victim to pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. Alternative researchers counter that the mainstream position is defensive, unwilling to consider evidence that challenges established models of ancient American history. What makes the LiDAR data significant is that it's not subjective interpretation of ambiguous artifacts or reliance on a single newspaper article from over a century ago. It's modern, scientific measurement of physical reality. Something is creating those void spaces beneath the canyon. The question is whether they're natural formations that happen to look somewhat regular, or whether they represent something more significant. If we assume for a moment that the rectilinear voids are artificial, two possibilities emerge. First, they could be ancient, the remains of whatever civilization Kincaid allegedly discovered, a vast complex extending far deeper than the surface caves mentioned in the Arizona Gazette article. This would mean that the 1909 expedition, if it happened, only scratched the surface of something much larger, a true subterranean city carved into and beneath the canyon. The second possibility is more contemporary and perhaps more unsettling. What if the voids are modern, excavated by the federal government following the initial discovery? What if authorities found exactly what Kincaid described, recognised its significance, and then spent decades carefully excavating and studying the site while maintaining complete secrecy? The restricted zones, the classified surveys, the missing documentation, all of it could be covering not just the original discovery, but an ongoing project that continues to this day. This second theory suggests that somewhere beneath the protected areas of the Grand Canyon, accessible only through heavily guarded entrances or even underground access points, miles away from the actual site, there exists a research facility studying artifacts and evidence that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient history. It sounds like science fiction, like conspiracy theory run wild. But is it really more fantastic than the possibility that ancient Egyptians built a city inside the Grand Canyon? Sometimes the cover-up and the original secret are equally difficult to believe. Government black projects exist. That's not speculation, it's documented fact. Programs like the Manhattan Project, Area 51's aviation testing, and numerous Cold War operations remained completely hidden for years or decades. The government has both the capability and the demonstrated willingness to conduct long-term classified projects when deemed necessary for national security or other priorities. Could the Grand Canyon's restricted zones hide something similar? The LiDAR data can't answer that question definitively. What it does is provide concrete evidence that something unusual exists beneath the surface in exactly the region where this story is focused for over a century. Whether that something is natural or artificial, ancient or modern, remains open to interpretation. But it's no longer possible to simply dismiss the entire story as baseless legend when modern scientific instruments are detecting anomalies that demand explanation. The patterns emerge. Take a step back and look at the full picture, the timeline of events, the pattern of official responses, and the physical evidence we can verify. In 1909, a detailed newspaper article describes an impossible discovery. Within years, the region is surveyed, mapped, and eventually brought under federal control. The individuals named in the article vanish from records. The institution allegedly sponsoring the work denies all knowledge. Access to the site becomes increasingly restricted. Documentation is missing or classified. Modern surveys detect unusual subsurface features, and all of this centres on a region that was named after Egyptian gods decades before the article was published. Each individual element might be explicable. Newspapers have published hoaxes. Records get lost. Restricted zones exist for legitimate safety reasons, but the cumulative weight of coincidence becomes harder to dismiss. At what point does coincidence become pattern? When does skepticism about conspiracy theories cross into willful blindness about anomalous evidence? The mainstream archaeological community's position on the Grand Canyon story has remained consistent. It's a hoax, a fabrication created by the Arizona Gazette to sell newspapers during a slow news period. Proponents of this view point out that no physical evidence has ever been produced, that none of the artifacts described in the article have surfaced in private collections or museum storage, and that the Smithsonian's denial should be taken at face value given the institution's reputation. Alternative researchers counter that the absence of physical evidence is exactly what you'd expect if there was a successful cover-up. They argue that the mainstream position relies on trusting institutional denials while ignoring the pattern of unusual facts surrounding the case. They point out that archaeological paradigms have been wrong before, that evidence once dismissed as impossible has later been validated, and that healthy scientific inquiry requires following evidence rather than defending established narratives. The debate has become somewhat polarised, with both sides entrenched in their positions. But perhaps the question shouldn't be framed as hoax versus conspiracy. Maybe there's a more nuanced truth that incorporates elements of both skepticism and openness to anomalous possibilities. Consider this scenario. Kincaid, or someone like him, did find caves in the Grand Canyon containing unusual artifacts. However, rather than the elaborate Egyptian Buddhist hybrid civilization described in the Arizona Gazette, the reality was more modest. Perhaps he found evidence of pre-Columbian contact, artifacts that suggested Pacific Islander or even Asian visitors had reached the Southwest in ancient times. Such a discovery would still be historically significant, challenging the isolation narrative of ancient America without requiring the fantastical civilization described in the newspaper. The Smithsonian, recognizing the potential controversy and lacking conclusive proof, might have decided to quietly collect and study the materials without making bold public claims. The Arizona Gazette, getting wind of the expedition, could have embellished and sensationalized the reality, transforming an interesting but ambiguous find into an impossible lost civilization story. When the article proved controversial and unsupportable in its most extreme claims, the Smithsonian backed away completely, denying involvement rather than trying to sort fact from fiction publicly. Over time, the site itself might have been deemed sensitive, not because it contains world-shaking secrets, but because it represents an ongoing legitimate archaeological investigation that needs protection from looters and amateur interference. The restrictions grew more comprehensive as technology made remote access easier, with drones and satellite imagery requiring countermeasures to prevent site disturbance. This scenario makes fewer assumptions than either the hoax theory or the elaborate cover-up theory. It allows for human fallibility, institutional caution, journalistic sensationalism, and legitimate, scientific concerns all playing roles in creating the mystery we see today. It's less dramatic than ancient Egyptian astronauts or underground alien bases, but it might be closer to truth than the polar extremes of the debate. The unanswered questions, regardless of which interpretation one favours, certain questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable without access to classified documentation or restricted areas. Why has no definitive evidence ever emerged one way or the other? In an age where information leaks are common, where whistleblowers regularly expose government secrets, why hasn't anyone with direct knowledge of what's really in those caves come forward with documentation, photographs, or artifacts? If it's all natural and innocent, why not simply allow independent researchers to visit and verify there's nothing unusual? If it's a cover-up, the number of people who would need to maintain silence over more than a century seems impossibly large. The silence itself is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the entire story. We have a detailed account from 1909 that describes specific locations and artifacts. We have over a century of rumour, speculation, and amateur investigation. We have modern technology capable of imaging beneath solid rock. Yet, we don't have resolution. The story exists in a strange limbo between debunked hoax and unverified truth, with evidence supporting both conclusions depending on how you weigh various factors. What's clear is that the region around Isis Temple holds significance beyond normal geological interest. The concentration of restrictions, the classified surveys, and the pattern of official responses indicate that federal authorities consider this area special in some way. Whether that special status derives from archaeological sensitivity, environmental fragility, or something more profound remains obscured by layers of bureaucracy and security classifications. The Native American communities who've inhabited the Grand Canyon region for thousands of years have their own stories about the deep places, about caverns that go down to other worlds, and chambers where the ancient ones left their marks. These oral traditions are often dismissed as mythology by Western archaeology, but they represent continuous cultural knowledge passed through generations. Some of these stories speak of places in the canyon that must not be disturbed, locations where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Could these traditional stories be describing the same locations that Kincaid allegedly found? Could native knowledge have preserved memory of sites that mainstream archaeology refuses to acknowledge? The relationship between indigenous oral tradition and Western scientific evidence is complex and often fraught with misunderstanding on both sides. But perhaps in this case, the traditional knowledge offers context that the archaeological debate lacks. The legacy of doubt. The Grand Canyon story has become a touchstone in alternative archaeology and conspiracy theory culture. It's referenced in books, documentaries, and internet forums as potential evidence for ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, and government cover-ups. This association with fringe theories has made serious investigation of the topic difficult. Academics who might otherwise be interested in examining the evidence risk professional reputation by engaging with a subject that's been so thoroughly claimed by the conspiracy theory community. This is unfortunate because regardless of the truth of the specific claims, the story raises legitimate questions about how we approach historical anomalies, how institutions handle controversial finds, and what happens when evidence doesn't fit established paradigms. These are important questions for archaeology, historiography, and philosophy of science. They deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal by association. The polarization also means that new evidence, when it emerges, gets interpreted through tribal lenses rather than evaluated on its merits. When the LiDAR data revealed subsurface anomalies, true believers saw confirmation of everything they'd always believed, while skeptics saw natural formations misinterpreted by motivated reasoning. Neither side seriously considered that the truth might lie somewhere between their positions or in directions neither had imagined. What would it take to resolve the mystery definitively? The most direct approach would be a properly funded, academically rigorous expedition, with full federal cooperation to examine the restricted areas around Isis Temple. Such an expedition would need authority to access the closed zones, equipment to safely reach and explore any cave systems present, and the expertise to properly document and interpret whatever is found. The results should be made public regardless of what's discovered. If there's nothing there, if the caves contain only natural formations and perhaps some modest evidence of ancient Native American use, that conclusion would end the speculation. If something more significant is found, it deserves proper archaeological study and public disclosure according to standard scientific protocols. The current situation, where access is prohibited and official denials prevent investigation, only feeds continued speculation and conspiracy theories. But such an expedition is unlikely to happen. The federal government has shown no inclination to address the controversy, preferring to let the story remain in the realm of fringe theories and dismissed legends. The academic establishment has little incentive to push for investigation of what they consider a debunked hoax. And the alternative research community, while passionate about the topic, lacks the resources and authority to conduct the kind of comprehensive study needed. So the mystery persists, passed from one generation of researchers to the next, always remaining tantalizingly unresolved. Each new piece of technology, from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar to LiDAR surveys, offers hope that definitive evidence will finally emerge. And each time, the evidence is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, keeping the debate alive but never reaching conclusion. The final accounting, more than 115 years have passed since the Arizona Gazette published its account of wonders hidden beneath the Grand Canyon's ancient stone. In that time we've split the atom, landed on the moon, mapped the human genome and developed artificial intelligence. Yet this one question, about whether an impossible civilization left traces in America's most iconic natural landmark remains unanswered. Perhaps that's fitting. The Grand Canyon itself is a monument to deep time, to geological processes operating over millions of years, creating beauty and grandeur beyond human scale. Against that backdrop, a century of human mystery seems appropriate, a small puzzle within a much larger wonder. But for those who've spent years investigating the story, tracing leads through archives, filing freedom of information requests, analysing maps and survey data, the lack of resolution is frustrating. They've uncovered enough anomalies to believe there's something to the story, but not enough hard evidence to prove their case definitively. They exist in an evidential limbo, convinced something important remains hidden, but unable to access what they need to demonstrate it. The true believers maintain faith that someday, somehow, the secrets will emerge. Perhaps a deathbed confession from someone involved in the alleged cover-up. Perhaps a discovery in some forgotten archive, documentation that everyone missed for decades. Perhaps a change in government policy that declassifies the restricted surveys and allows independent verification of the site. They wait for vindication, for the moment when the world has to acknowledge they were right all along. The skeptics continue to dismiss the entire affair as a lesson in critical thinking, an example of how elaborate stories can persist despite lack of evidence, how human desire for mystery and hidden knowledge creates narratives that satisfy emotional needs rather than evidentiary standards. They see the believers as victims of confirmation bias, interpreting ambiguous information through lenses of pre-existing belief rather than objective analysis. And the rest of the world mostly ignores the controversy entirely, visiting the Grand Canyon as tourists, marvelling at its beauty, taking photographs and moving on with their lives, completely unaware that beneath their feet, if the stories are true, lies evidence that would rewrite everything we think we know about ancient human history. In the end, what are we left with? A newspaper article from 1909 describing an impossible discovery. A pattern of missing documentation and vanished individuals, a region of national parkland with unusual restrictions and security measures, modern geological surveys detecting anomalous subsurface features, and more than a century of debate that has convinced no one and resolved nothing. Maybe the answer was discovered more than 100 years ago, documented in reports that sit in classified archives, physically locked away in storage facilities we're not allowed to access. Maybe those artifacts described in the Arizona Gazette, the copper tools and hieroglyphic tablets and stone sarcophagi, rest in carefully climate-controlled vaults, studied by researchers bound by security clearances and non-disclosure agreements, slowly revealing secrets about human history that we won't learn for generations. Or maybe there's nothing there at all except natural caves and the wishful thinking of people who want the world to be more mysterious than it is. Maybe G.E. Kincaid was a fraudster or a fantasist. The Arizona Gazette was complicit in a hoax or a victim of a con artist, and the Smithsonian's denials are entirely truthful. Maybe the restrictions around Isis Temple protect only endangered species and fragile ecosystems. Maybe the LIDAR anomalies are just unusual geology, with natural explanations we haven't fully worked out yet. The honest answer is that we don't know. We can't know without access to information and locations that remain prohibited. The mystery endures because resolution is prevented by the same factors that create the mystery in the first place: secrecy, restriction, missing documentation, and official denial. What we can say with certainty is that the story refuses to die. Every few years, a new generation discovers the Arizona Gazette article and begins asking the same questions their predecessors asked. Technology advances, new analytical tools become available, and researchers apply these fresh capabilities to old evidence, hoping for the breakthrough that will finally crack the case open. The search continues because the human drive to solve mysteries, to uncover hidden truths, is stronger than the frustration of repeated dead ends. The Grand Canyon keeps its secrets well. That's what it does. It's kept secrets in stone for millions of years, revealing them only grudgingly, layer by layer, to patient geological inquiry. If there are human secrets hidden in those depths alongside the geological ones, they seem equally protected, equally patient, equally unwilling to yield themselves easily to investigation. Stand at the rim and look down into those profound depths. See the layers of time stacked in bands of colour, each representing epochs almost incomprehensible in duration. Consider that somewhere in that vast expanse of ancient stone, if the story is true, evidence exists that would force us to fundamentally reconsider human history. Or consider that the story is false, and the real wonder is the canyon itself, which needs no ancient civilizations or government conspiracies to be extraordinary. Either way, the question persists. What lies in the forbidden depths? What secrets does the Grand Canyon guard? Did G.E. Kincaid discover something world-changing in 1909, or did he discover nothing at all? Is the Smithsonian hiding evidence that would revolutionize archaeology, or simply refusing to dignify a baseless hoax with serious response? Are the restricted zones protecting something profound, or just protecting sensitive areas from public disturbance? The answer exists somewhere, in classified files or non-existent fabrications, in sealed caves or empty stone, in conspiracy or coincidence. But until someone with the authority, resources and determination to find out emerges and demands resolution, the mystery endures. The forbidden depths keep their secrets, and perhaps that's how it will remain. One more mystery in a world that has far too few of them left. One more question without an answer in an age that assumes all questions can be answered with sufficient research and technology. The Grand Canyon has witnessed the entire span of human existence on this continent play out as barely a moment in its geological lifetime. It will witness our civilization's end, whatever form that takes, with the same indifference it's shown everything else. Against that perspective, whether an ancient Egyptian colony carved crypts in its cliffs seems almost trivial. But it doesn't feel trivial to those who've spent years chasing this story. To them, it's everything. It's proof that history is deeper and stranger than we've been told. It's evidence that conventional wisdom is sometimes wrong. It's validation that asking questions and challenging official narratives serves a purpose. Or it's a lesson in critical thinking, a cautionary tale about believing extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. Take your pick. Believe what makes sense to you. But remember that choosing disbelief based on absence of public evidence is no more epistemologically sound than choosing belief based on absence of definitive refutation when the evidence is sealed behind classified barriers and restricted access zones. The story of the Grand Canyon's hidden chambers, of Egyptian statues in Arizona caves, of explorers who vanished from history and institutions that deny what they once discovered, remains unresolved. It will likely remain unresolved long after everyone reading these words has turned to dust. The canyon will still be there, silent and eternal, keeping whatever secrets it holds, refusing to care whether we believe or doubt, whether we search or surrender. And maybe that's the most profound truth of all, that some mysteries persist not because they're difficult to solve, but because their resolution is prevented by human choice. That the greatest secrets might be hidden not by time or technology, but by simple prohibition, by locked gates and classified stamps, and official denials that can never quite be overcome by civilian inquiry. The forbidden depths remain forbidden. The secrets, if secrets they are, remain secret. And somewhere in the heart of America's most magnificent natural wonder, something waits in darkness, known or unknown, real or imaginary, significant or mundane, kept from us by distance and prohibition and the slow decay of memory. Until the day someone decides that we deserve to know the truth, whatever that truth might be, the mystery endures. The Grand Canyon keeps its secrets, and we are left to wonder, to speculate, to argue among ourselves about what might or might not lie hidden in stone. forever tantalized by the possibility that just out of reach, just beyond the barriers, something extraordinary awaits discovery. Or nothing at all. That too is possible, and in the absence of certainty we each choose what to believe. They moved with efficient, brutal precision that spoke of years of practice and unlimited resources. Men in dark tactical gear emblazoned with HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, flooded her apartment like a coordinated invasion force. They carried electronic jammers that immediately killed her internet connection and cell phone signal, ensuring that no evidence of the raid could be transmitted to the outside world. Mara didn't resist. She couldn't. The revelation of her own name in the exercise documents had shattered something fundamental in her understanding of reality. She sat frozen in her chair as they systematically dismantled her entire investigation, bagging computers, hard drives, printed documents, and the original VHS tape that had started everything. Mara Ellison, the team leader announced, his voice carrying the flat, bureaucratic authority of someone who had recited these words many times before. You are being detained under the Espionage Act and the provisions of the Patriot Act for the unauthorized access of classified material and conspiracy to aid terrorist entities in their ongoing operations against the United States. The charges were absurd, but Mara understood that absurdity was the point. In the post-9/11 legal framework, the government's definition of terrorism had expanded to include almost any activity that challenged official narratives. Her research, her questions, her very curiosity had been redefined as acts of treason. As they led her out in handcuffs, past the terrified faces of neighbours who would remember her as the woman who had turned out to be a spy, Mara caught a glimpse of someone watching from across the street. It was Kellerman, the man from the cafe, observing her arrest with the detached professionalism of someone monitoring a completed operation. Their eyes met for a brief moment and he nodded slightly, not in greeting or sympathy, but in acknowledgement, a confirmation that everything had proceeded according to plan. The government's case against her was presented in a sealed FISA court, where neither the evidence nor the proceedings were accessible to public scrutiny. They had documentation of her accessing classified servers, recordings of her encrypted communications with foreign assets like at Radar Ghost, and her own research notes that they characterized as intelligence gathering for hostile entities. They presented her investigation not as the work of a concerned citizen or independent researcher, but as a sophisticated espionage operation designed to undermine public confidence in government institutions and aid terrorist recruitment. Every question she had asked was reframed as an attack on national security. Every fact she had uncovered was presented as intelligence that could be used against American interests. The judge, operating under national security guidelines that prioritise state secrets over due process, sentenced her to indefinite detention in ADX Florence, the federal supermax facility designed to make dangerous criminals disappear from the world. She was classified as a Level 6 terrorist, a designation that eliminated most constitutional protections and ensured that she would spend the rest of her life in solitary confinement. But something unexpected happened in the weeks following her arrest. Fragments of her research began appearing online, leaked to conspiracy theory websites and alternative media platforms in carefully edited chunks. Anonymous accounts uploaded her audio analysis comparing the ATC recordings. her financial charts tracking the put options, and scanned pages from Dr. Thorne's suppressed paper. The leaks were incomplete and disconnected, presenting tantalizing glimpses of a larger truth without providing the comprehensive narrative that Mara had spent months constructing. Each fragment raised more questions than it answered, creating a puzzle that thousands of amateur researchers began trying to solve. The story spread through the conspiracy theory ecosystem with viral intensity. Mara Ellison became a martyred truth-teller, a patriotic whistleblower who had been silenced by a tyrannical government for asking inconvenient questions. Her name appeared on protest signs and bumper stickers. Her fragmented research became the foundational text of a new generation of 9/11 truth-seekers who built elaborate theories around the gaps in her evidence. Online forums dedicated to her case attracted hundreds of thousands of members who spent countless hours analysing every leaked document, enhancing every audio file, and connecting dots that may or may not have been related. The movement consumed enormous amounts of time and energy from people who might otherwise have been investigating more immediate and actionable forms of government corruption. In her solitary cell, staring at concrete walls that never varied, Mara had years to think about what had really happened to her. She had access to limited reading materials, carefully selected books and magazines that were screened for security risks, but no internet, no phone calls, and no contact with the outside world except for monthly visits from a government-appointed psychiatrist who documented her mental state for official records. During those long, empty hours, she began to understand the true sophistication of the operation she had been part of. The evidence she had uncovered was real. The financial anomalies, the radar substitutions, the media manipulation had all been genuine. But her discovery of them hadn't been accidental. She had been led to each revelation by a carefully constructed trail that had made her feel like an independent investigator while actually being a participant in a psychological experiment. The goal wasn't to suppress inconvenient truths about September 11th. It was to manage them, to ensure that people who asked dangerous questions were given satisfying, but ultimately harmless answers that would occupy their attention without threatening the real power structures that had profited from the attacks. Her research had been allowed to develop just far enough to create compelling conspiracy theories, but not far enough to identify the specific individuals and institutions that were actually responsible. She had mapped the edges of the conspiracy while being carefully steered away from its centre. The 9/11 truth movement that had grown around her, leaked research was exactly what the system needed. A large, vocal, but ultimately marginalised group that absorbed dissent and channeled it into harmless activities like conference presentations, documentary films, and internet discussions. The conspiracy theorists served as controlled opposition, providing an outlet for skepticism while ensuring that genuine investigation was drowned in a sea of speculation and theory. But perhaps most insidiously, her case had established a precedent for the treatment of future researchers. Anyone who began asking serious questions about government actions would be confronted with the example of Mara Ellison, the translator who had thought she was uncovering truth, but had actually been playing a role in an elaborate deception, and who had ended up spending her life in prison for crimes she didn't understand she was committing. The message was clear. The cost of curiosity was too high, the risk of investigation was too great, and the line between research and treason was too thin for ordinary citizens to navigate safely. Years passed in the unchanging routine of maximum security imprisonment. Mara aged in her cell, her dark hair going grey, her body adapting to the constraints of a space designed to contain rather than rehabilitate. She developed the 1,000-yard stare common to long-term solitary confinement, a psychological adjustment to environmental deprivation that allowed consciousness to survive even when hope had been systematically eliminated. But her mind remained sharp and she continued to think about the implications of her experience. If her investigation had been managed from the beginning, if her discoveries had been strategically placed for her to find, then how many other conspiracy theories were actually psychological operations designed to misdirect public attention? How many whistleblowers had been selected and groomed for their role? How many leaked documents were authentic information released in carefully controlled ways to create the illusion of transparency while actually deepening the confusion? How many truth seekers were unwittingly serving the interests of the very systems they believed they were opposing? The questions haunted her, but they also provided a strange form of comfort. Even in prison, even stripped of freedom and identity, she was still thinking, still analysing, still trying to understand the shape of the cage that had been built around human consciousness. In her 10th year of imprisonment, Mara received an unexpected visitor. The guard who escorted her to the visitation room was apologetic. Visits were rare, and this one hadn't been scheduled through normal channels. The visitor was a young woman, perhaps 25, with the intense focus and slightly manic energy that Mara recognised in herself from decades earlier. "Ms. Ellison," the woman said, speaking quickly as if afraid their time would be cut short. "My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've been researching your case for the past 3 years, and I think I've found something important. Something about Building 7 that nobody has ever." Mara held up her hand, stopping the young woman mid-sentence. Through the reinforced glass that separated them, she looked into Rebecca's eager, determined face and saw herself at the beginning of a journey that could only end in this same room on the other side of the same glass. "Ms. Torres," Mara said quietly, her voice rough from years of disuse, "let me ask you something. How did you first learn about my case? What was the first piece of evidence that made you think there was a story worth investigating?" Rebecca's enthusiasm was undimmed. It was a video file that was posted anonymously to a secure drop site, footage of Building 7 that I'd never seen before, with audio that hadn't been available in any of the official archives. The timing discrepancies were obvious once you knew what to look for. Mara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Another tape, another anomaly, another researcher being led down a carefully prepared path that would feel like discovery, while actually being manipulation. "Ms. Torres," she said, opening her eyes and looking directly at the young filmmaker, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to walk out of here, delete whatever research you've done and never think about any of this again." But even as she spoke, Mara knew it was hopeless. Rebecca Torres had the same look in her eyes that Mara had once seen in her own mirror, the absolute certainty that she was on the verge of uncovering a truth that would change everything. The same conviction that had led Mara to spend 20 years in a cage built from her own curiosity. The cycle would continue. New researchers would be recruited, new evidence would be strategically placed, new truth seekers would be transformed into unwitting participants in their own imprisonment. The conspiracy wasn't just about what had happened on September 11th. It was about what happened to anyone who tried to look too closely at power, who asked too many questions, who believed that truth was something that could be found rather than something that was manufactured. As the guard led her back to her cell, Mara realised that she had finally understood the true scope of the operation she had been part of. It wasn't a conspiracy to hide a single crime. It was a system for managing reality itself, for ensuring that the truth would always be whatever those in power needed it to be. The smoke behind the towers wasn't just the debris of a single day's deception. It was the fog of war in a conflict that most people didn't even know was being fought. A war against the very possibility of independent thought, waged with weapons of information and cages built from curiosity itself. And in that war, every truth seeker was both a casualty and a weapon, both a victim and an unwitting soldier in an army that was fighting against its own cause. The tape that shouldn't exist had led her exactly where it was supposed to lead her, into a truth that was indistinguishable from a lie, a cage that was built from the very evidence that had seemed to promise freedom. In the end, Mara Ellison had found exactly what she was looking for, and that perhaps was the most terrifying revelation of all. The smoke behind the towers, an extended investigation. What if the single most defining event of the 21st century wasn't what we were told? We've all seen the footage, heard the official story, and lived with the consequences. But what happens when a single piece of evidence lost in the system for over 2 decades falls into the hands of the one person with the skills and obsession to see the cracks in the narrative? This is not a story about easy answers. It's a story about the questions that can unravel a reality. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Sleep Theories and hit the notification bell. We dive deep into the world's greatest mysteries, and what you're about to read will have you questioning everything. In the comments below, let us know. After learning about the inconsistencies, what's the one piece of the 9/11 puzzle that never sat right with you? Now settle in. This is the smoke behind the towers. The dust in Mara Ellison's apartment was a library of dead projects. It settled on the spines of German legal dictionaries, coated the cooling fins of her overworked computer, and formed a fine grey film on the stacked plastic boxes of government transcripts that were her livelihood. The apartment itself was a testament to organised chaos. Cables snaking between translation equipment, multiple keyboards in different alphabets, and towers of reference materials that threatened to topple with each vibration from the subway below. Mara was a freelance translator, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy, hired for her fluency in 5 languages and her singular, obsessive attention to detail. She didn't just translate words, she translated context, subtext, and the terrifying silence between official lines. Her clients range from immigration lawyers needing farcy depositions, translated to federal agencies requiring real-time interpretation of intercepted communications. It was solitary work that suited her temperament. She'd always been more comfortable with the precision of language than the chaos of human interaction. The package from the Department of Defense's Archival Division was standard. A reinforced cardboard box, a chain of custody form clipped to the top, and inside 12 VHS tapes labelled with alphanumeric codes denoting a declassified batch of field communications from the early 2000s. The accompanying documentation was sparse. A single-page memo requesting translation of any foreign language chatter captured in the background. The pay was modest but steady, and Mara had developed a reputation for catching linguistic details that others missed. Her workspace was a shrine to analogue precision. The professional-grade VCR, a Sony model worth more than most people's cars, sat connected to a digital audio interface that allowed her to isolate frequency ranges and enhance muffled conversations. Multiple monitors displayed waveform analysis software alongside translation databases. She worked methodically, her headphones sealing her in a world of static, fragmented Farsi, Arabic phrases, and the ambient hum of old magnetic tape. The first 11 tapes were unremarkable. Routine military communications, helicopter pilots discussing weather conditions, occasional snippets of foreign languages that were either too corrupted to translate or turned out to be harmless civilian chatter picked up by sensitive equipment. She documented everything with academic precision, noting timestamps, speaker identifications, and confidence levels for her translations. Tape 7 was different from the moment she picked it up. Its label, DOD-AFC-0 91101-BROLL-4, was slightly smudged, the ink appearing fresher than the others despite the identical date stamps. The B-roll designation caught her attention, typically used for supplementary footage, background material that never made it to air. September 11th, 2001 was faded but legible in the corner, written in what looked like different handwriting than the official labels. She slotted it into the VCR with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a fragile artifact, and pressed play. The screen fizzed to life with a chaotic, familiar horror of that morning. But this wasn't the sanitized, repeatedly broadcast footage that had been burned into collective memory. This was raw, unprocessed, shot from what appeared to be a news helicopter hovering at an angle she'd never seen before. The North Tower bled a furious black plume into a perfect blue sky, but the colours were wrong. They were too vivid, too saturated, as if the horror had been amplified by the unfiltered lens. Her trained eye, honed by years of spotting inconsistencies in testimony and documentation, caught it immediately. In the lower third of the frame, a time code burned into the tape read 08:42:17 Eastern Standard Time. She knew the official timeline by heart. American Airlines. Flight 11 had struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m, a 4-minute discrepancy. A chill, small and precise, traced a path down her spine. Technical errors were common in archival footage, she rationalised. Equipment malfunctions, camera operators forgetting to sync their timestamps. She'd seen it hundreds of times in legal depositions where security cameras showed impossible timelines. But as she continued watching, the discrepancy held. The timecode advanced in perfect synchronization with real time, never jumping or resetting. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was consistent, deliberate, accurate. And if it was accurate, then everything she knew about that morning was built on a foundation of sand. Then she heard the voices. They were not the panicked cries of civilians or the frantic dispatches of news anchors that had filled the airwaves. These voices were cool, professional, crackling with the distinct compression of military-grade communication systems. They were barely audible under the rotor wash and wind noise, but her equipment could isolate and enhance them. "Command, this is Skywatch. Confirmed scenario is live. Repeat, is this Vigilant Guardian live or real world?" The voice was young, male, with the clipped precision of military training but an undertone of confusion that made Mara's pulse quicken. A pause, filled with the sound of roaring fire and distant sirens. When the response came, it was from a different voice, older, calmer, carrying the authority of rank. "Maintain exercise protocol. All units. This is a live fly exercise. Treat all tracks as simulated until otherwise notified." The first voice came back, strain creeping in. "Skywatch copies. Maintaining protocol. Jesus, that's a lot of smoke for a simulation." Another voice joined the channel, different again, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "Command, Falcon 2 requesting permission to vector intercept on the southern track. We show multiple bogies, but exercise parameters did not account for this density. Negative Falcon 2, maintain exercise posture. All tracks are part of the scenario until command confirms otherwise." Mara's breath caught in her throat. Vigilant Guardian. The name meant nothing to her, but the context was unmistakable. They were talking about an exercise, a drill, at the exact moment when the real attack was unfolding. The confusion in their voices was genuine. They couldn't tell what was real and what was simulation. She rewound the tape, listening again with professional focus. The voices were too clear to be atmospheric noise, too organised to be random civilian communications. This was operational military chatter, recorded at the highest levels of the response hierarchy. And according to the time code, it was happening before the official narrative said the first plane had even hit. The camera panned, and she saw the South Tower in the background, pristine and untouched. According to every official record, every news report, every commission finding, the South Tower would remain undamaged for another 17 minutes. But these military voices were already talking about multiple targets, exercise protocols, and maintaining simulation status. The official story was a solid wall, a monument of accepted fact constructed from thousands of testimonies, investigations and reports. But this tape was a hairline fracture in the granite. It was a glimpse of the scaffolding behind the monument, the framework that held up the official truth. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rational part of her mind insisted this was a mislabeled tape, a bureaucratic error. Her contract was explicit about mishandled materials. They were to be reported immediately, returned to the appropriate authorities for proper classification review. But curiosity, that quiet, relentless engine that had driven her through graduate school and into a career built on uncovering meaning in chaos, overrode the fear. She didn't eject the tape. Instead, she connected it to her digital capture system and began making a perfect copy, frame by frame, preserving every pixel and every audio sample. The chill in her spine had become a frozen river, carrying with it the terrible realization that she was holding something that could unravel everything. This tape shouldn't exist, and she knew, with the terrifying certainty of someone who has spent a lifetime connecting dots that others refused to see, that she could never unsee what was on it. As the tape played on, she began taking meticulous notes, documenting call signs, voice patterns, and radio procedures. The military communications continued throughout the footage, painting a picture of an operation that was simultaneously a drill and a real-world crisis, a Schrödinger's catastrophe where reality and simulation existed in quantum superposition, until someone with the authority to collapse the wave function decided what was real. That someone she was beginning to suspect was not who the world thought it was. Sleep didn't come. The images played on the backs of her eyelids in an endless loop. The impossibly blue sky, the black smoke billowing against it, the time code burning like a digital scar across her vision. The voices echoed in her memory, their professional calm masking confusion that ran deeper than anyone had ever admitted publicly. By 5 a.m, she was at her desk, the glow of her monitors the only light in the pre-dawn gloom of her apartment. The city outside was beginning its daily resurrection, but Mara existed in a different timeline now, one where the morning of September 11th, 2001 was not history, but an active investigation. Her first stop was the public archive of the 9/11 Commission, a digital tomb containing thousands of pages of testimony, exhibits, and evidence. She had accessed these files before for various translation projects, but now she approached them with the focus of a detective rather than a linguist. The official transcripts were sanitized, edited for clarity and context, with extensive redactions that created black holes in the narrative where sensitive information had been surgically removed. But buried deep in a subsidiary server, linked through footnotes and cross-references that most casual researchers would never follow, she found the motherlode. Raw audio files from air traffic control centers. These were the unedited feeds from Boston Center, New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, and Cleveland Center, the front lines of confusion that morning. She put on her professional headphones, the world fading away as she prepared to immerse herself in the chaos. The audio quality was poor, compressed through multiple digital transfers over 2 decades, but her equipment could clean it up. She opened her spectrum analysis software and began the painstaking process of isolating individual voices from the cacophony. The first recordings were exactly what she expected. Controllers struggling to understand what was happening to American Airlines Flight 11. The standard protocols were breaking down in real time as they tried to re-establish contact with a plane that was no longer responding to their calls. American 11, Boston Center, are you there? The controller's voice was professional but edged with the first hints of concern. Static filled the channel. American 11, Boston Center, please respond. More urgent now, the procedural calm beginning to crack. Then a new voice entered the channel, higher pitched, laced with confusion. Boston Center, this is New York approach. We're showing a primary target, fast mover, not squawking transponder. Is this part of the Nordo drill? Nordo, no radio communications. Mara's blood turned to ice water. The Boston controller's response was immediate and sharp. What drill? I don't have anything about a drill on the roster today. What's your location on that primary? Another voice cut in. Different frequency, probably a pilot monitoring emergency channels. Center, this is Delta 243 Heavy. We're hearing some strange chatter on guard frequency. Are we exercising today? Our dispatcher didn't mention anything. Delta 243, stand by. We're trying to sort out some communication issues with one of our aircraft. But the pilot pressed. Center, serious question. We're showing traffic on our TCAS that doesn't correlate with what you're calling out. Our system is painting targets where you're not showing anything. Is this part of some kind of exercise? The timestamp on this exchange was 8:43 a.m., 3 minutes before the official time of impact. The confusion wasn't happening after the attack. It was the environment in which the attack was unfolding. The system was already compromised, already uncertain about what was real and what was simulation. Mara spent the next 16 hours obsessively comparing this raw audio to the sanitized news footage from that morning, using professional editing software to align timelines with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. She created a split-screen comparison, audio waveforms on one side, video timestamps on the other, and she found them, the edits. In the raw ATC tape, a controller could be heard screaming, "He's descending fast, passing 9,000 rate of descent. Jesus Christ, what the hell is he?" The audio cut out completely for exactly 0.2 of a second. A perfect digital slice that could only have been made in post-production. When it resumed, a different controller was speaking in measured professional tones. We have an aircraft emergency, requesting immediate vectors for emergency descent. The panic had been surgically removed, replaced with standard phraseology that suggested control rather than chaos. She found 17 such edits in the first hour of ATC audio alone. Each one removed confusion, uncertainty, or references to exercises and drills. The real-time breakdown of the air traffic control system had been edited into a narrative of professionals responding to an unprecedented but comprehensible crisis. But the video footage revealed even more sophisticated manipulation. She had obtained raw news helicopter footage from multiple sources, some from official archives, others from amateur collectors who had recorded the live broadcasts. Frame-stepping through a raw feed uploaded by a news photographer years later, she discovered something that made her hands shake. The famous shot of the second impact, broadcast live to millions, showed the plane entering the frame and striking the South Tower in one continuous motion. But in the unedited raw footage, there was a discontinuity. 3 frames before the impact, the camera jerked violently downward, as if the operator had been startled or knocked off balance, showing the streets below for exactly 1/8 of a second before cutting back to the tower, just in time to capture the fireball. It was a blink and you miss it edit, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. The live broadcast had been edited in real time, with a buffer delay that allowed editors to remove the moment of human shock and replace it with a perfect, unobstructed view of the impact. The audience of one in her dusty apartment was now facing a terrifying possibility. The news wasn't just reporting the event, it was curating it in real time, managing the narrative as it unfolded, ensuring that the world saw exactly what someone wanted them to see. The difference between what happened and what was broadcast might be measured in fractions of seconds, but those fractions contained entire universes of meaning. She pulled up the official timeline, cross-referencing it with her growing database of anomalies. The pattern was clear. Every moment of confusion, every instance where the official response system revealed its underlying chaos, had been carefully edited out of the historical record. What remained was a streamlined narrative of surprise, response, and tragedy, clean enough to build policy on, coherent enough to justify the reshaping of an entire civilization. But the real story was in the gaps, in the deleted seconds where the facade slipped and revealed the machinery underneath. The tape she had found wasn't just evidence of poor timekeeping or sloppy journalism. It was proof that someone had been editing history in real time, sculpting reality as it unfolded, ensuring that the official story would be the only story that survived. The question that now consumed her was simple and terrible. If they were editing the news as it happened, what else were they controlling? The digital rabbit hole led her inevitably to the physical world. Knowledge had a weight, she realised, and after 3 days of staring at screens, she needed to feel the heft of actual books, the texture of paper that had existed before the internet had made all information suspect. The New York Public Library's Science, Industry and Business Library was a temple to pre-digital knowledge, its research floors filled with bound periodicals and technical journals that predated the homogenization of online information. She took the subway through the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of every face, every reflection in the train windows, the paranoia now a constant background hum in her consciousness. She requested archived journals from the American Society of Civil Engineers, Structural Engineering International, and the Journal of Constructional Steel Research, focusing on publications from late 2001 through 2003. The librarian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who seemed to exist in permanent twilight, led her to a research carrel buried deep in the stacks. The official reports were unequivocal and had been cited thousands of times. The intense jet fuel fires had softened the steel structural members, causing thermal expansion that pushed the floor joists off their supports. The floors pancaked down onto each other in a progressive collapse that accelerated due to the increasing mass and momentum. It was tragic but straightforward physics. Fire weakens steel, gravity does the rest. But in the months immediately following the attacks, before the official narrative had crystallized and academic careers had been threatened, a different conversation was happening in the margins of professional literature. She found letters to the editor, brief technical notes, and transcripts from early conferences where structural engineers voiced quiet, professional skepticism. One article, published in a now-defunct journal called Structural Integrity Review, bore the innocuous title Anomalies in the WTC Collapse Dynamics, a Preliminary Analysis. The author was Dr. Aris Thorne, a professor of structural engineering at Northwestern University with 40 years of experience in high-rise design and failure analysis. Dr. Thorne's analysis was methodical and damning. Using basic principles of physics and publicly available measurements, he demonstrated that the towers had fallen through the path of greatest resistance, the undamaged lower floors and the intact core columns at virtually free-fall speed. For that to happen, he argued, the structural resistance had to have been removed almost entirely and almost simultaneously. The observed collapse is consistent with the near instantaneous failure of critical load-bearing elements across multiple floors, he wrote. This failure mode is not consistent with thermal effects from hydrocarbon fires, which would create non-uniform heating and progressive failure. It is, however, consistent with controlled demolition techniques designed to minimize structural resistance during collapse. He included mathematical models showing that even if the fires had weakened the steel by 50%, far more than the official reports claimed, the remaining structure should have provided significant resistance to collapse. The floors should have fallen irregularly, the core columns should have remained standing, and the overall collapse time should have been significantly longer. It is akin to a car falling through the bottom of a multi-storey parking garage, he wrote, with each floor providing progressively less resistance, despite having suffered no structural damage. The physics simply do not support the official explanation. The article was peer-reviewed and published in March 2002. 3 months later, Dr. Thorne's research funding was terminated. By the end of the year, the journal itself had ceased publication, its parent organisation citing financial difficulties and changing market conditions. But Mara's investigation revealed a more complex story. Cross-referencing the journal's subscription database with the author affiliations in Dr. Thorne's article, she discovered that 7 of the 12 peer reviewers who had approved the paper were subsequently denied tenure, transferred to non-research positions, or had their federal funding mysteriously disappear. The systematic dismantling of the academic infrastructure that had supported the questioning of the official narrative was surgical in its precision. Dr. Thorne himself became her new obsession. His university profile, archived on the Internet Wayback Machine, showed a distinguished career spanning 4 decades, with over 200 published papers and millions of dollars in research grants. But in early 2002, his page was updated to show that he had taken an indefinite sabbatical for personal reasons. She dug deeper, following a trail through archived academic mailing lists, conference proceedings, and professional networking sites. The last traces of Dr. Thorne's professional existence were found in a niche engineering message board devoted to structural failure analysis. The forum had been active from 1997 to 2003, when it was apparently taken offline permanently. But Mara had learned to look in the forgotten corners of the internet, the places where data went to die but never quite disappeared. Using advanced search techniques and cached page reconstructions, she found fragments of the discussion threads. Dr. Thorne's final posts were increasingly frantic in tone. He described pressure from university administrators, threats to his family's safety, and mysterious visitors who claimed to be federal investigators but carried no proper identification. His last post, dated September 15, 2002, exactly 1 year and 4 days after the attacks, was brief and chilling. The data is the data. Mathematical models don't lie. Steel doesn't care about politics, and gravity is not a government agency. They can threaten my funding, my reputation, even my family. But they can't change the laws of physics. I've said all I can. To those still listening, they're watching. I suggest you all be careful what you look for. You might not like what finds you back. He never posted again. A follow-up news search revealed a brief article from the Chicago Tribune, buried on page 7 of the Metro section 6 months later. University professor missing. Foul play not suspected. The article was perfunctory, almost dismissive. Dr. Thorne had been reported missing by his sister when he failed to appear for Christmas dinner. His car was found at O'Hare Airport, keys in the ignition, a plane ticket to Vancouver in his name unused at the gate. Professor Thorne had been under considerable stress related to academic disputes. An unnamed university spokesperson was quoted as saying, "This appears to be a case of someone needing to start fresh somewhere else." But there was no trail after that. No credit card usage, no bank withdrawals, no rental agreements or employment records under his name, or any obvious aliases. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man who had spent 40 years building a paper trail of academic achievement, had simply evaporated. Mara closed her eyes in the sterile library lighting, the weight of the revelation settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. The systematic silencing hadn't been limited to Dr. Thorne. As she continued her research, she found a pattern of structural engineers, metallurgists, and physics professors who had raised questions about the official collapse narrative in those crucial first months after the attacks. All of them had faced professional consequences. All of them had been marginalised, defunded or discredited, and all of them had eventually stopped asking questions about September 11th. The few who continued their research had moved to other countries, found positions in private industry, or simply disappeared from the academic record entirely. What remained was a consensus not of discovery but of survival, a scientific community that had learned, through selective pressure and systematic intimidation, that certain questions would not be tolerated. The official story wasn't just the accepted version of events, it was the only version that was professionally survivable. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the library, Mara felt exposed under the flickering fluorescent lights. The paranoia was no longer abstract. There was a physical sensation, a cold certainty that she was being observed, catalogued, evaluated for the threat she might represent. The knowledge she was accumulating had a price, she realised, and others had already paid it. The question now was whether she would be added to the list of people who had learned too much for their own good. The feeling of being watched had evolved from paranoia into operational security. Mara began varying her routines, taking different routes home, using cash for purchases, and conducting her most sensitive research from internet cafes and public libraries, rather than her home computer. She had read enough about surveillance to know that once you were on someone's radar, digital footprints became roadmaps to your location and intentions. She also began using layered VPNs, routing her internet traffic through servers in countries with strong privacy laws, and communicating through encrypted channels that existed in the shadow spaces of the internet. Her investigation moved from mainstream archives to the digital underworld where disgruntled employees, amateur researchers, and information brokers traded in data that governments preferred to keep buried. It was in one such forum, a dark website dedicated to air disaster investigations and aviation anomalies, that she encountered the handle at Radar Ghost. His initial posts in the 9/11 section were bitter rants about cover-ups and government lies, the kind of conspiracy theorising that most serious researchers ignored. But buried in his rambling messages were technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of air traffic control systems. After weeks of careful cultivation, building trust through shared technical knowledge and encrypted private messages, at Radar Ghost agreed to share something that had haunted him for over 20 years. "This will cost me everything if it's traced back to me," he wrote, in a message encrypted with military-grade protocols. "I was working approach control at a facility that doesn't exist in any official record. We had primary radar coverage of the entire East Coast corridor. I saw things that morning that were scrubbed from every official database, but I kept copies. Insurance, you understand. Don't disappoint me." The file arrived 3 days later, a massive data dump disguised as a corrupted email attachment. When Mara finally decrypted and decompressed it, she found herself staring at 24 hours of raw primary radar returns from September 11th, 2001, not the sanitized transponder data that appeared in official reports, but the unfiltered radar reflections from every object in the sky over the eastern United States. The data was overwhelming. Commercial airliners, private jets, military aircraft, weather balloons, and the electronic noise that cluttered the airspace of the world's busiest aviation corridor. It took her days to write filtering algorithms, cleaning the data, and tracking specific radar signatures through the chaos. She focused first on American Airlines Flight 77, the Boeing 757 that had allegedly struck the Pentagon. The official story was straightforward. The flight had departed Dulles International Airport on schedule, proceeded normally for 36 minutes, then turned off its transponder over southern Ohio, made a wide U-turn back toward Washington, and descended into the Pentagon at high speed. But the raw radar data told a more complex story. The transponder signal for Flight 77 did indeed vanish over Ohio at 8:56 a.m., exactly as the official report stated. But the primary radar target, the physical reflection from the aircraft itself, continued westward for another 63 nautical miles before it simply disappeared from the screen. It didn't fade gradually or descend below radar coverage. It vanished instantly, as if the aircraft had been switched off like a light bulb. Simultaneously, a new primary target appeared on the scope near the West Virginia border, moving southeast at 540 knots toward Washington, D.C. This new radar signature had the exact characteristics of a Boeing 757. The same cross-sectional area, the same speed capabilities, the same flight profile. But according to the official timeline, the real Flight 77 was already well to the east and no longer under radar coverage. The timing was surgical in its precision. The original target disappeared at exactly 9:09:32 a.m. The new target appeared at 9:09:34 a.m., 2 seconds later and 60 miles to the south. It was as if the aircraft had been teleported, or as if one plane had been replaced by another in a carefully choreographed handoff. Radar Ghost's encrypted messages provided context. See it now? The swap. We called it aircraft substitution in our training manuals, something the military practices during war games when they need to simulate different aircraft types or flight profiles. They paint a new bird on the screen using electronic countermeasures, make the old one disappear using radar jammers. We saw what they wanted us to see. Mara cross-referenced the radar data with archived flight tracking information from that morning. The pattern became even more disturbing when she examined United Airlines Flight 175, which had struck the South Tower. Like Flight 77, its transponder signal disappeared over New Jersey, but the primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing north for another 40 miles, before vanishing and being replaced by a different target that descended into Manhattan. The implications were staggering. The radar evidence suggested that the aircraft everyone watched strike the World Trade Center and Pentagon were not the original commercial flights. They were substitutes, introduced into the airspace during the confusion of the morning's military exercises. But substitutes for what? If the original flights hadn't crashed into the buildings, what had happened to them? And what exactly had struck the towers? Her correspondence with Radar Ghost became increasingly cryptic as he realized the magnitude of what he had revealed. His final message was short and urgent. They know I've been talking. Moving the family tonight. The data you have is real, but is only part of the picture. Look for the fighter jets that weren't supposed to be there. Look for the electronic warfare signatures. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone who claims to be trying to help you. The people who did this have been cleaning up loose ends for 20 years. The account at Radar Ghost went dark after that message. When Mara tried to reach him through back-channel communications, she found that all his digital identities had been systematically erased. Email accounts closed, forum profiles deleted, encrypted messaging services showing no record of his user credentials. It was as if he had never existed. But the radar data remained, a digital fossil of a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The morning of September 11th hadn't just been a terrorist attack, it had been the largest military deception operation in modern history, a shell game played with passenger aircraft while the world watched in horror. The question that now consumed Mara's every waking moment was simple and terrifying. If the planes that struck the buildings weren't the original flights, and if the original flights had been made to disappear somewhere over the American heartland, then who was responsible for the greatest aviation magic trick ever performed? And more importantly, what had happened to the 244 people who had been aboard those vanished aircraft? The scope of the deception was threatening to overwhelm her analytical capabilities. Aircraft substitution, media manipulation, academic intimidation. The threads were weaving together into a pattern so vast and complex that her rational mind struggled to process it. She needed something concrete, something that operated according to simpler rules than military operations or information warfare. She needed to follow the money. Financial markets were brutal in their honesty. Numbers didn't lie, couldn't be intimidated into silence, and left paper trails that were nearly impossible to completely erase. If someone had advanced knowledge of the attacks, they would have found ways to profit from that knowledge, and those profits would be traceable. Mara spent her remaining savings on access to premium financial databases and trading analysis software. She focused on the 3 trading days immediately preceding September 11th, 2001, looking for anomalies that screamed insider knowledge. The first anomaly was so blatant it seemed impossible that it hadn't been front-page news for months. Put options, essentially bets that a stock's price would fall, had spiked to unprecedented levels for American Airlines and United Airlines stock. The volume was not just unusual. It was statistically impossible without advanced knowledge. American Airlines put options had increased by 1,300%, above normal volume on September the 6th and 7th. United Airlines puts had spiked by 1,100% over the same period. Someone had wagered hundreds of millions of dollars that these 2 specific airlines, and only these 2 airlines, were about to experience catastrophic losses. But the betting wasn't limited to the airlines. Insurance companies had been targeted with similar precision. Marsh & McLennan, the insurance brokerage that occupied floors 93 to 100 of the North Tower, had been hit with massive put option purchases. So had Swiss Re and Munich Re, 2 reinsurance giants that would face billions in claims from the attacks. Even more specifically, put options had been purchased against Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and other financial firms that had major offices in the World Trade Center complex. The pattern was surgical. Only companies that would be directly impacted by the destruction of the towers were targeted for bearish betting. The profits from these trades, had they been collected, would have totaled over $2.5 billion. It was the most successful short-selling operation in financial history, predicated on advanced knowledge of one of the most devastating attacks in human history. Mara traced the trading orders through a labyrinth of financial intermediaries. The initial purchases had been placed through a network of small brokerages in Germany, Switzerland and Japan, locations chosen for their bank secrecy laws and regulatory opacity. But using advanced financial forensic software, she was able to peel back the layers of financial obfuscation. The ultimate source of funding led to a Russian bank called Seveny Trust, which intelligence analysts had identified as a clearinghouse for money laundering operations tied to former Soviet intelligence services. But even that wasn't the end of the trail. The most chilling discovery came when she traced what had happened to the profits. The put options had not been exercised. In the days following September 11th, when these trades would have generated enormous profits, they had been quietly abandoned. The traders had walked away from $2.5 billion rather than claim winnings that would have created an obvious money trail leading back to the conspiracy. But Mara's analysis revealed that equivalent amounts of money had simultaneously appeared in accounts tied to defence contractors and private military companies. Blackwater, Halliburton, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, corporations that would become the primary beneficiaries of the post-9/11 military-industrial complex, had received massive, mysterious capital injections in the weeks following the attacks. The money hadn't been collected as trading profits, which would have triggered regulatory investigations. Instead, it had been recycled through a complex network of shell corporations and offshore accounts, ultimately funding the very companies that would profit most from the subsequent war on terror. She cross-referenced this financial data with stock performance in the months following the attacks. Defence contractor stocks had exploded in value. Blackwater had grown from a small military training company to a billion-dollar private army. Halliburton had received no-bid contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The weapons manufacturers had seen their stock prices triple as America embarked on 2 decades of perpetual warfare. The pattern was inescapable. The same financial networks that had bet against the airlines and insurance companies had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the military response to the attacks. It was a perfect financial strategy. Short the targets, invest in the solution, then create the crisis that makes both positions profitable. But the most damning evidence came from an analysis of the timing. The put options hadn't just been purchased in the days before the attacks. They had been strategically timed to expire on September 21st, 2001, exactly 10 days after the attacks. This wasn't random speculation or lucky guessing. It was a precisely calibrated financial operation designed to maximize profits from advanced knowledge of a specific date. Mara sat back in her chair, the weight of the discovery crushing down on her. She had always imagined that if 9/11 was an inside job, it would be motivated by grand geopolitical strategy, ideological fanaticism, or the pursuit of imperial power. The reality was both more mundane and more horrifying. It was about money. The attacks weren't just a catalyst for reshaping global politics. They were the centerpiece of the most profitable investment strategy in human history. The towers had fallen, 3,000 people had died, and 2 decades of war had followed, all to execute a financial plan that had generated trillions of dollars for a small group of investors who had known exactly what was going to happen and when. She began mapping the ownership structures of the shell companies that had received the laundered profits. The network was vast and sophisticated, but patterns emerged. Many of the ultimate beneficiaries were names she recognized from business headlines. Defense industry executives, private equity firms specializing in military contractors, and investment funds that had emerged from nowhere in the early 2000s to become major players in the military-industrial complex. But one name kept appearing in her analysis, buried deep in the ownership structures and corporate boards: Meridian Group, a private investment firm that seemed to exist at the nexus of defense contracting, intelligence services, and international finance. Every financial thread she followed eventually led back to companies with Meridian connections. Meridian Group had been founded in 1999 by former intelligence officials and Wall Street executives. Its public portfolio focused on emerging security technologies and crisis management solutions. But Mara's research revealed that it also held controlling interests in companies across the entire 9/11 profit chain: the defense contractors who built the weapons, the private military companies who fought the wars, the surveillance technology firms who monitored the homeland, and the financial institutions that funded the entire operation. It was a vertically integrated conspiracy, a corporate structure designed to profit from every aspect of the post-9/11 world. And if her analysis was correct, the same people who had financed the attacks had then positioned themselves to profit from the response, creating a closed loop of violence and profit that had sustained itself for over 2 decades. The scope of the financial conspiracy was staggering, but it also provided something that the other evidence had lacked: concrete proof of premeditation. Markets might be manipulated, radar might be spoofed, and media might be controlled, but money trails were nearly impossible to completely obscure. The put options were smoking gun evidence that someone had known exactly what was going to happen on September 11th and had invested billions of dollars to profit from that knowledge. As she compiled her financial research into a comprehensive report, Mara realized she was no longer just investigating a terrorist attack. She was mapping the architecture of a shadow economy built on manufactured crisis, where the same people who created the problems also owned the companies that sold the solutions. The question was no longer whether 9/11 had been an inside job. The financial evidence made that undeniable. The question was how many other crises, how many other wars, how many other national emergencies had been manufactured by the same network of investors who had learned that terror was the most profitable business on Earth.